Among the towns of Jutland, Viborg justly holds a high place. It is the seat of a bishopric. It has a handsome but almost entirely new cathedral, a charming garden, a lake of great beauty, and many storks. Near its Hald, accounted one of the prettiest things in Denmark, and hard by is Fingerup, where Marsk Stig murdered King Eric Glipping on Cecilia's Day in the year 1286. 56 blows of square-headed iron maces were traced on Eric's skull when his tomb was opened in the 17th century, but I am not writing a guidebook. There are good hotels in Viborg. Priestlers and the Phoenix are all that can be desired, but my cousin, whose experiences I have to tell you now, went to the Golden Lion the first time that he visited Viborg. He has not been there since, and the following pages will perhaps explain the reason of his abstention. The Golden Lion is one of the very few houses in town that were not destroyed in the Great Fire of 1726, which practically demolished the cathedral, the Sognekirk, the Rathaus, and so much else that was old and interesting. It is a great red brick house. That is, the front is of brick, with Corby steps on the gables and a text over the door. But the courtyard into which the omnibus drives is of black and white cagework and wood and plaster. The sun was declining in the heavens when my cousin walked up to the door, and the light smote full upon the imposing facade of the house. He was delighted with the old-fashioned aspect of the place and promised himself a thoroughly satisfactory and amusing stay in an inn so typical of old Jutland. It was not business in the ordinary sense of the word that had brought Mr. Anderson to Viborg. He was engaged upon some researches into the church history of Denmark, and it had come to his knowledge that the Rigsarkiv of Viborg there were papers, saved from the fire, relating to the last days of Roman Catholicism in the country. He proposed, therefore, to spend a considerable time, perhaps as much as a fortnight or 3 weeks, in examining and copying these, and he hoped that the Golden Lion would be able to give him a room of sufficient size to serve alike as a bedroom and a study. His wishes were explained to the landlord, and after a certain amount of thought, the latter suggested that perhaps it might be the best way for the gentleman to look at one or two of the larger rooms and pick one for himself. It seemed a good idea. The top floor was soon rejected as entailing too much getting upstairs after the day's work. The second floor contained no room of exactly the dimensions required, but on the first floor there was a choice of 2 or 3 rooms which would, so far as size went, suit admirably. The landlord was strongly in favor of number 17, but Mr. Anderson pointed out that its windows commanded only the blank wall of the next house, and that it would be very dark in the afternoon. Either number 12 or number 14 would be better, for both of them looked on the street, and the bright evening light and the pretty view would more than compensate him for the additional amount of noise. Eventually, number 12 was selected. Like its neighbors, it had 3 windows, all on one side of the room. It was fairly high and unusually long. There was, of course, no fireplace, but the stove was handsome, rather old, a cast-iron erection, on the side of which was a representation of Abraham sacrificing Isaac, and the inscription, 1 Bogmose, Cap 22, above. Nothing else in the room was remarkable. The only intriguing picture was an old colored print of the town, date about 1820. Supper time was approaching, but when Anderson, refreshed by the ordinary ablutions, descended the staircase, there were still a few minutes before the bell rang. He devoted them to examining the list of his fellow lodgers. As is usual in Denmark, their names were displayed on a large blackboard, divided into columns and lines, the numbers of the rooms being painted in at the beginning of each line. The list was not exciting. There was an advocate, or sagfører, a German, and some bagmen from Copenhagen. The one and only point which suggested any food for thought was the absence of any number 13 from the tail of the rooms. And even this was a thing which Anderson had already noticed half a dozen times in his experience of Danish hotels. He could not help wondering whether the objection to that particular number, common as it is, was so widespread and so strong as to make it difficult to let a room so ticketed, and he resolved to ask the landlord if he and his colleagues in the profession had actually met with many clients who refused to be accommodated in the 13th room. He had nothing to tell me. I am giving the story as I heard it from him, about what passed at supper, and the evening, which was spent in unpacking and arranging his clothes, books, and papers, was not more eventful. Towards 11 o'clock he resolved to go to bed, but with him, as with many good other people nowadays, an almost necessary preliminary to bed, if he meant to sleep, was the reading of a few pages of print, and he now remembered that the particular book which he had been reading in the train, and which alone would satisfy him at that present moment, was in the pocket of his greatcoat, then hanging on a peg outside the dining room. To run down and secure it was the work of a moment, and as the passages were by no means dark, it was not difficult for him to find his way back to his own door. So, at least, he thought. But when he arrived there and turned the handle, the door entirely refused to open, and he caught the sound of a hasty movement towards it from within. He had tried the wrong door, of course. Was his own room to the right or to the left? He glanced at the number. It was 13. His room would be on the left, and so it was. And not before he had been in bed for some minutes had read his wonted 3 or 4 pages of his book, blown out his light, and turned over to go to sleep, did it occur to him that, whereas on the blackboard of the hotel there had been no number 13, there was undoubtedly a room numbered 13 in the hotel. He felt rather sorry he had not chosen it for his own. Perhaps he might have done the landlord a little service by occupying it, and given him the chance of saying that a well-born English gentleman had lived in it for 3 weeks and liked it very much, but probably it was used as a servant's room or something of the kind. After all, it was most likely not so large or good a room as his own, and he looked drowsily about the room, which was fairly perceptible in the half-light from the street lamp. It was a curious effect, he thought. Rooms usually look larger in dim light than in a full one, but this seemed to have contracted in length and grown proportionately higher. Well, sleep was more important than these vague ruminations, and to sleep he went. On the day after his arrival, Andersen attacked the Riksarkiv of Viborg. He was, as one might expect in Denmark, kindly received, and access to all that he wished to see was made as easy for him as possible. The documents laid before him were far more numerous and interesting than he had at all anticipated. Besides official papers, there was a large bundle of correspondence relating to Bishop Jorgen Frills, the last Roman Catholic who held the see, and in these there cropped up many amusing and what are called intimate details of private life and individual character. There was much talk of a house owned by the bishop, but not inhabited by him, in the town. Its tenant was apparently somewhat of a scandal and a stumbling block to the reforming party. He was a disgrace, they wrote, to the city. He practiced secret and wicked arts and had sold his soul to the enemy. It was of a piece with the gross corruption and superstition of the Babylonish church that had such a viper and blood-sucking trollman should be patronized and harbored by the bishop. The bishop met these reproaches boldly. He protested his own abhorrence of all such things as secret arts, and required his antagonists to bring the matter before the proper court, of course the spiritual court, and sift it to the bottom. No one could be more ready and willing than himself to condemn Nicholas Franken, if the evidence showed him to have been guilty of any of the crimes informally alleged against him. Andersen had not had time to do more than glance at the next letter of the Protestant leader, Rasmus Nielsen, before the record office was closed for the day, but he gathered its general tenor, which was to the effect that Christian men were now no longer bound by the decisions of the Bishop of Rome, and that the bishop's court was not and could not be a fit or competent tribunal to judge so grave and weighty a cause. On leaving the office, Mr. Andersen was accompanied by the old gentleman who presided over it, and as they walked, the conversation very naturally turned to the papers of which I have just been speaking. Herr Scavenius, the archivist of Viborg, Though very well informed as to the general run of the documents under his charge, was not a specialist in those of the Reformation period. He was much interested in what Anderson had to tell him about them. He looked forward with great pleasure, he said, to seeing the publication in which Mr. Anderson spoke of embodying their contents. This house of the Bishop Freeze, he added, it is a great puzzle to me where it can have stood. I have studied carefully the topography of Old Viborg, but it is most unlucky. Of the old terrier of the bishop's property, which was made in 1560, and of which we have the greater part in the archive, just the piece which had the list of the town property is missing. Never mind, perhaps I shall some day succeed to find him. After taking some exercise, I forget exactly how or where, Anderson went back to the Golden Lion, his supper, his game of patience, and his bed. On the way to his room, it occurred to him that he had forgotten to talk to the landlord about the omission of number 13 from the hotel, and also that he might as well make sure that number 13 did actually exist before he made any reference to the matter. The decision was not difficult to arrive at. There was the door with its number as plain as could be, and work of some kind was evidently going on inside it, for as he neared the door he could hear the footsteps and voices, or a voice, within. During the few seconds in which he halted to make sure of the number, the footsteps ceased, seemingly very near the door, and he was a little startled at hearing a quick hissing breathing, as of a person in strong excitement. He went on to his own room, and again he was surprised to find how much smaller it seemed now than it had when he selected it. It was a slight disappointment, but only slight. If he found it really not large enough, he could very easily shift to another. In the meantime, he wanted something. As far as I remember, it was a pocket handkerchief out of his portmanteau, which had been placed by the porter on the very inadequate trestle or stool against the wall at the farthest end of the room from his bed. Here was a very curious thing. The portmanteau was not to be seen. It had been moved by officious servants. Doubtless the contents had been put in the wardrobe. No, none of them were there. This was vexatious. The idea of a theft he dismissed at once. Such things rarely happen in Denmark, but some piece of stupidity had certainly been performed, which is not so uncommon, and the maid must be severely spoken to. Whatever it was that he wanted, it was not so necessary to his comfort that he could not wait till the morning for it, and he therefore settled not to ring the bell and disturb the servants. He went to the window, the right-hand window it was, and looked out on the quiet street. There was a tall building opposite, with large spaces of dead wall, no passers-by, a dark night, and very little to be seen of any kind. The light was behind him, and he could see his own shadow clearly cast on the wall opposite, also the shadow of the bearded man in number 11 on the left, who passed to and fro in shirt-sleeves at once or twice, and was seen first brushing his hair, and later on in a nightgown. Also the shadow of the occupant of number 13 on the right. This must be more interesting. Number 13 was, like himself, leaning on his elbows on the windowsill looking out onto the street. He seemed to be a tall, thin man, or was it by any chance a woman? At least, it was someone who covered his or her head with some kind of drapery before going to bed, and, he thought, must be possessed of a red lampshade, and the lamp must be flickering very much. There was a distinct playing up and down of a dull red light on the opposite wall. He craned out a little to see if he could make any more of the figure, but beyond a fold of some light, perhaps white, material on the windowsill he could see nothing. Now came a distant step in the street, and its approach seemed to recall number 13 to a sense of his exposed position, for very swiftly and suddenly he swept aside from the window, and his red light went out. Anderson, who had been smoking a cigarette, laid the end of it on the windowsill and went to bed. Next morning he was woke by the maid with hot water, etc. He roused himself, and after thinking out the correct Danish words, said as distinctly as he could, "You must not move my portmanteau. Where is it?" As is not uncommon, the maid laughed and went away without making any distinct answer. Anderson, rather irritated, sat up in bed, intending to call her back, but he remained sitting up, staring straight in front of him. There was his portmanteau on its trestle, exactly where he had seen the porter put it when he first arrived. This was a rude shock for a man who prided himself on his accuracy of observation. How could it have possibly escaped him in the night before he did not pretend to understand? At any rate, there it was now. The daylight showed more than the portmanteau. It let the true proportions of the room with its 3 windows appear, and satisfied its tenant that his choice after all had not been a bad one. When he was almost dressed, he walked to the middle one of the 3 windows to look out at the weather. Another shock awaited him. Strangely unobservant he must have been last night. He could have sworn 10 times over that he had been smoking at the right-hand window the last thing before he went to bed, and here was his cigarette end on the sill of the middle window. He started to go down to breakfast, rather late, but number 13 was later. Here were his boots still outside his door, a gentleman's boots. So then number 13 was a man, not a woman. Just then he caught sight of the number on the door. It was 14. He thought he must have passed number 13 without noticing it. 3 stupid mistakes in 12 hours were too much for a methodical, accurate-minded man, so he turned back to make sure. The next number to 14 was number 12, his own room. There was no number 13 at all. After some minutes devoted to a careful consideration of everything he had had to eat and drink during the last 24 hours, Anderson decided to give the question up. If his sight or his brain were giving way, he would have plenty of opportunities for ascertaining that fact. If not, then he was evidently being treated to a very interesting experience. In either case, the development of the events would certainly be worth watching. During the day, he continued his examination of the episcopal correspondence, which I have already summarized. To his disappointment, it was incomplete. Only one other letter could be found which referred to the affair of Mag Nicholas Franken. It was from the Bishop Jorgen Fries to Rasmus Nielsen. He said, "Although we are not in the least degree inclined to assent to your judgment concerning our court, and shall be prepared if need be to withstand you to the utmost in the behalf, yet forasmuch as our trustee and well-beloved Mag Nicholas Franken, against whom you have dared to allege certain false and malicious charges, hath been suddenly removed from among us, it is apparent that the question for this time falls. But forasmuch as you further allege that the apostle and evangelist St. John in his heavenly apocalypse describes the Holy Roman Church under the guise and symbol of the Scarlet Woman, be it known to you," etc. Search as he might, Anderson could find no sequel to this letter, nor any clue to the cause or manner of the removal of the casus belli. He could only suppose that Franken had died suddenly, and as there were only 2 days between the date of Nielsen's last letter, when Franken was evidently still in being, and that of the bishop's letter, the death must have been completely unexpected. In the afternoon he paid a short visit to Hald and took his tea at Bakeland, nor could he notice, though he was in a somewhat nervous frame of mind, that there was any indication such as failure of eye or brain as his experiences of the morning had led him to fear. At supper he found himself next to the landlord. "What," he asked him, after some indifferent conversation, "is the reason why in most of the hotels one visits in this country the number 13 is left out of the list of rooms? I see you have none here." The landlord seemed amused. "To think that you should have noticed a thing such as that. I've thought about it once or twice myself, to tell the truth. An educated man, I've said, has no business with these superstitious notions. I was brought up myself here in the high school of Viborg, and our old master was always a man to set his face against anything of that kind. He's been dead now for many years. A fine upstanding man he was, and ready with his hands as well as his head. I recollect us boys one snowy day." Here he plunged into reminiscence. "Then you don't think there is any particular objection to having room 13, said Anderson. "Ah, to be sure. Well, you understand, I was brought up to the business by my poor old father. He kept a hotel in Aarhus first, and then, when we were born, he moved to Viborg here, which was his native place, and had the Phoenix here until he died. That was in 1876. Then I started business in Soekborg, and only the year before last I moved into this house." Then followed more details as to the state of the house and business when first taken over. "And when you came here, was there a number 13? No, I was going to tell you about that. You see, in a place like this, the commercial class, the travelers, are what we have to provide for in general, and put them in number 13, why, they'd as soon sleep in the street, or sooner. As far as I'm concerned myself, it wouldn't make a penny difference to me what the number of my room was, and so I've often said to them, but they stick to it, and that it brings them bad luck. Quantities of stories they have among them of men who have slept in number 13 and never been the same again, or lost their best customers, or one thing or another, said the landlord after searching for more graphic phrase. Then what do you use your number 13 for? Said Anderson, conscious as he said the words of a curious anxiety quite disproportionate to the importance of the question. My number 13? Why don't I tell you that there isn't such a thing in the house? I thought you might have noticed that. If there was, it would be next door to your own room. Well, yes, I only happened to think. That is, I fancied last night that I had seen a door numbered 13 in that passage, and really, I am almost certain I must have been right, for I saw it the night before as well. Of course, Herr Christensen laughed this notion to scorn, as Anderson had expected, and emphasized with much iteration the fact that no number 13 existed, or had existed, before him in that hotel. Anderson was, in some ways, relieved by his certainty, but still puzzled. And he began to think that the best way to make sure whether he had indeed been subject to an illusion or not was to invite the landlord to his room to smoke a cigar later on in the evening. Some photographs of English towns which he had with him formed a sufficiently good excuse. Herr Christensen was flattered by the invitation and most willingly accepted it. At about 10 o'clock he was to make his appearance, but before that Anderson had some letters to write and retired for the purpose of writing them. He almost blushed to himself at confessing it, but he could not deny that it was the fact that he was becoming quite nervous about the question of the existence of number 13. So much so that he approached his room by way of number 11 in order that he might not be obligated to pass the door, or the place where the door ought to be. He looked quickly and suspiciously about the room when he entered it, but there was nothing beyond that indefinable air of being smaller than usual to warrant any misgivings. There was no question of the presence or absence of his portmanteau tonight. He had himself emptied it of its contents and lodged it under his bed. With a certain effort he dismissed the thought of number 13 from his mind and sat down to his writing. His neighbors were quiet enough. Occasionally a door opened in the passage and a pair of boots was thrown out, or a bagman walked past humming to himself, and outside, from time to time, a cart thundered over the atrocious cobblestones, or a quick step hurried along the flags. Anderson finished his letters, ordered in whiskey and soda, and then went to the window and studied the dead wall opposite and the shadows upon it. As far as he could remember, number 14 had been occupied by the lawyer, a staid man who said little at meals, being generally engaged in studying a small bundle of papers beside his plate. Apparently, however, he was in the habit of giving vent to his animal spirits when alone. Why else should he be dancing? The shadow from the next room evidently showed that he was. Again and again his thin form crossed the window. His arms waved, and a gaunt leg was kicked up with surprising agility. He seemed to be barefooted, and the floor must be well laid, for no sound betrayed his movements. Save for Herr Anders Jensen dancing at 10 o'clock at night in the hotel bedroom seemed a fitting subject for a historical painting in the grand style, and Anderson's thoughts, like those of Emily and the mysteries of Udolpho, began to arrange themselves in the following lines. When I return to my hotel at 10 o'clock p.m., the waiters think I am unwell. I do not care for them. But when I've locked my chamber door and put my boots outside, I dance all night upon the floor, and even if my neighbors swore, I'd go on dancing all the more, for I am acquainted with the law, and in despite of all their jaw, their protest I deride. Had not the landlord at this moment knocked at the door, it is probable that quite a long poem might have been laid before the reader. To judge from his look of surprise when he found himself in the room, Herr Christensen was struck, as Anderson had been, by something unusual in its aspect, but he made no remark. Anderson's photographs interested him mightily, and formed the text of many autobiographical discourses. Nor is it quite clear how the conversation could have been diverted into the desired channel of number 13, had not the lawyer at this moment begun to sing, and to sing in a manner which could leave no doubt in anyone's mind that he was either exceedingly drunk or raving mad. It was a high, thin voice that they heard, and it seemed dry, as if from long disuse. Of words or tune there was no question. It went on sailing up to a surprising height, and was carried down with a despairing moan as of a winter wind in a hollow chimney, or an organ whose wind fails suddenly. It was really a horrible sound, and Anderson felt that if he had been alone he must have fled for refuge in society to some neighbor bagman's room. The landlord sat open-mouthed. "I don't understand it," he said at last, wiping his forehead. "It is dreadful. I have heard it once before, but I made sure it was a cat." "Is he mad?" said Anderson. "He must be, and what a sad thing. Such a good customer, too, and so successful in his business by what I hear, and a young family to bring up." Just then came an impatient knock at the door, and the knocker entered without waiting to be asked. It was the lawyer, in dishabille and very rough-haired, and very angry he looked. "I beg pardon, sir," he said, "but I should be much obliged if you would kindly desist." Here he stopped, for it was evident that neither of the persons before him was responsible for the disturbance, and after a moment's lull it swelled forth again and more wildly than before. "But what in the name of heaven does it mean?" broke out the lawyer. "Where is it at? Who is it? Am I going out of my mind?" "Surely, Herr Jensen, it comes from your room next door. Isn't there a cat or something stuck in the chimney?" This was the best that occurred to Anderson to say, and he realized the futility as he spoke, but anything was better than to stand and listen to that horrible voice, and to look at the broad, white face of the landlord, all perspiring and quivering as he clutched the arms of his chair. "Impossible," said the lawyer, "impossible. There's no chimney. I came here because I was convinced the noise was going on here. It was certainly in the room next to mine." "Was there no door between yours and mine?" said Anderson eagerly. "No, sir," said Herr Jensen, rather sharply. "At least not this morning." "Ah," said Anderson, "nor tonight?" "I am not sure," said the lawyer with some hesitation. Suddenly the crying or singing voice in the next room died away, and the singer was heard seemingly to laugh to himself in a crooning manner. The three men actually shivered at the sound. Then there was a silence. "Come," said the lawyer, "what have you to say, Herr Christensen? What does this mean?" "Good heavens," said Christensen, "how should I tell? I know no more than you, gentlemen. I pray that I may never hear such a noise again." "So do I," said Herr Jensen, and he added something underneath his breath. Anderson thought it sounded like the last words of the Psalter, "Omnis spiritus laudet Dominem," but he could not be sure. "But we must do something," said Anderson, "the three of us. Shall we go and investigate the next room?" "But that is Herr Jensen's room," wailed the landlord. "It is no use. He has come from there himself." "I am not so sure," said Jensen. "I think this gentleman's right. We must go and see." The only weapons of defense that could be mustered on the spot were a stick and umbrella. The expedition went out into the passage, not without quakings. There was a deadly quiet outside, but a light shone from under the next door. Anderson and Jensen approached it. The latter turned the handle and gave a sudden vigorous push. No use. The door stood fast. "Herr Christensen," said Jensen, "will you go and fetch the strongest servant you have in the place? We must see this through." The landlord nodded and hurried off, glad to be away from the scene of action. Jensen and Anderson remained outside looking at the door. "It is number 13, you see," said the latter. "Yes, there is your door, and there is mine," said Jensen. "My room has 3 windows in the daytime," said Anderson with difficulty suppressing a nervous laugh. "By George, so has mine," said the lawyer, turning and looking at Anderson. His back was now to the door. In that moment, the door opened, and an arm came out and clawed at his shoulder. It was clad in ragged, yellowish linen, and the bare skin, where it could be seen, had long gray hair upon it. Anderson was just in time to pull Jensen out of its reach with a cry of disgust and fright when the door shut again, and a low laugh was heard. Jensen had seen nothing, but when Anderson hurriedly told him what a risk he had run, he fell into a great state of agitation and suggested that they should retire from the enterprise and lock themselves up in one or the other of their rooms. However, while he was developing this plan, the landlord and 2 able-bodied men arrived on the scene, all looking rather serious and alarmed. Jensen met them with a torrent of description and explanation, which did not at all tend to encourage them for the fray. The men dropped the crowbars they had brought and said flatly that they were not going to risk their throats in that devil's den. The landlord was miserably nervous and undecided, conscious that if the danger were not faced, his hotel was ruined, and very loath to face it himself. Luckily, Anderson hit upon a way of rallying the demoralized force. "Is this," he said, "the Danish courage I have heard so much of? It isn't a German in there, and if it was, we are 5 to 1. The 2 servants and Jensen were stung into action by this and made a dash at the door. "Stop," said Anderson. "Don't lose your heads. You stay out here with the light, landlord, and one of you 2 men break in the door and don't go in when it gives way." The men nodded, and the younger stepped forward, raised his crowbar, and dealt a tremendous blow on the upper panel. The result was not in the least what any of them anticipated. There was no cracking or rending of wood, only a dull sound, as if a solid wall had been struck. The man dropped his tool with a shout and began rubbing his elbow. His cry drew their eyes upon him for a moment. Then Anderson looked at the door again. It was gone. The plaster wall of the passage stared him in the face, with a considerable gash in it where the crowbar had struck it. Number 13 had passed out of existence. For a brief space they stood perfectly still, gazing at the blank wall. An early cock in the yard beneath was heard to crow, and as Anderson glanced in the direction of the sound, he saw through the window at the end of the long passage that the eastern sky was paling to the dawn. "Perhaps," said the landlord with hesitation, "you gentlemen would like another room for tonight, a double-bedded one?" Neither Jensen nor Anderson was averse to the suggestion. They felt inclined to hunt in couples after their late experience. It was found convenient, when each of them went to his room to collect the articles he wanted for the night, that the other should go with him and hold a candle. They noticed that both number 12 and number 14 had 3 windows. Next morning, the same party reassembled in number 12. The landlord was naturally anxious to avoid engaging outside help, and yet it was imperative that the mystery attaching to that part of the house should be cleared up. Accordingly, the 2 servants had been induced to take upon them the function of carpenters. The furniture was cleared away, and, at the cost of a good many irretrievably damaged planks, that portion of the floor was taken up which lay nearest to number 14. You will naturally suppose that a skeleton, say that of Mag Nicholas Franken, was discovered. That was not so. What they did find lying between the beams which supported the flooring was a small copper box. In it was a neatly folded vellum document with about 20 lines of writing. Both Anderson and Jensen, who proved to be something of a paleographer, were much excited by this discovery, which promised to afford the key to the extraordinary phenomena. I possess a copy of an astrological work which I have never read. It has, by way of frontispiece, a woodcut by Hans Sebald Behem, representing a number of sages seated around a table. This detail may enable connoisseurs to identify the book. I cannot myself recollect its title, and it is not at this moment within reach, but the fly-leaves of it are covered with writing, and during the 10 years in which I have owned the volume, I have not been able to determine which way up this writing ought to be read, much less in what language it is. Not dissimilar was the position of Anderson and Jensen after the protracted examination to which they submitted the document in the copper box. After 2 days' contemplation of it, Jensen, who was the bolder spirit of the 2, hazarded the conjecture that the language was either Latin or Old Danish. Anderson ventured upon no surmises, and was very willing to surrender the box and the parchment to the Historical Society of Viborg to be placed in their museum. I had the whole story from him a few months later, as we sat in a wood near Uppsala, after a visit to the library there, where we, or rather I, had laughed over the contract by which Daniel Southenus, in later life professor of Hebrew at Königsberg, sold himself to Satan. Anderson was not really amused. Young idiot, he said, meaning Sultaness, who was only an undergraduate when he committed that indiscretion. How did he know what company he was courting? And when I suggested the usual considerations, he only grunted. That same afternoon, he told me what you have read, but he refused to draw any inferences from it, and to assent to any that I drew for him.
Fisher, said the captain, may sound a very plebeian name, but this family is of a very ancient lineage, and for many hundreds of years they have possessed a very curious old place in the Cumberland, which bears the weird name of Crogland Grange. The great characteristic of the house is that never at any period of its long existence has it been more than 1 story high, but it has a terrace from which large grounds sweep away towards the church in the hollow, and a fine distant view. When, in lapse of years, the Fishers outgrew Crogland Grange, in family and fortune, they were wise enough not to destroy the long-standing characteristic of the place by adding another story to the house, but they went away to the south to reside at Thorncombe near Guildford, and they let Crogland Grange. They were extremely fortunate in their tenants, 2 brothers and a sister. They heard their praises from all quarters. To their poorer neighbors, they were all that is most kind and beneficent, and their neighbors of a higher class spoke of them as a most welcome addition to the little society of the neighborhood. On their part, the tenants were greatly delighted with their new residence. The arrangement of the house, which would have been a trial to many, was not so to them. In every respect, Crogland Grange was exactly suited to them. The winter was spent most happily by the new inmates of Crogland Grange, who shared in all the little social pleasures of the district, and made themselves very popular. In the following summer, there was one day which was dreadfully, annihilatingly hot. The brothers lay under the tree with their books, for it was too hot for an active occupation. The sisters sat in the veranda and worked, or tried to work. For the intense sultriness of the summer day, work was next to impossible. They dined early, and after dinner they sat out on the veranda, enjoying the cool air which came with the evening, and they watched the sunset and the moon rise over the belt of trees which separated the grounds from the churchyard, seeing it mount the heavens till the whole lawn was bathed in silver light, across which the long shadows from the shrubbery fell, as if embossed, so vivid and distinct they were. When they separated for the night, all retiring to their rooms on the ground floor, for, as I said, there were no upstairs in that house, the sister felt that the heat was still so great that she could not sleep, and having fastened her window, she did not close the shutters. In that very quiet place, it was not necessary, and, propped against the pillows, she still watched the marvelous beauty of that summer night. Gradually she became aware of two lights which flickered in and out in the belt of trees which separated the lawn from the churchyard, and as her gaze became fixed upon them, she saw them emerge, fixed in a dark substance, a definitely ghastly something, which seemed at every moment to become nearer, increasing in size and substance as it approached. Every now and then it was lost for a moment in the long shadows which stretched across the lawn from the trees, and then it emerged, larger than ever, and still coming on. As she watched it, the most uncontrollable horror seized her. She longed to get away, but the door was close to the window, and the door was locked on the inside, and while she was unlocking it, she must be for an instant nearer to it. She longed to scream, but her voice seemed paralyzed, her tongue glued to the roof of her mouth. Suddenly, she could never explain why afterwards, the terrible object seemed to turn to one side, seemed to be going round the house, not to be coming to her at all, and immediately she jumped out of the bed and rushed to the door. But as she was unlocking it, she heard scratch, scratch, scratch upon the window, and saw a hideous brown face with flaming eyes glaring at her. She rushed back to the bed, but the creature continued to scratch, scratch, scratch upon the window. She felt a sort of mental comfort in the knowledge that the window was securely fastened on the inside. Suddenly the scratching sound ceased, and a kind of pecking sound took its place. Then, in her agony, she became aware that the creature was unpicking the lead. The noise continued, and a diamond pane of glass fell into the room. Then a long bony finger of the creature came in and turned the handle of the window, and the window opened, and the creature came in, and it came across the room, and her terror was so great that she could not scream, and it came up to the bed, and it twisted its long bony fingers into her hair, and it dragged her head over the side of the bed, and it bit her violently in the throat. As it bit her, her voice was released, and she screamed with all her might and main. Her brothers rushed out of their rooms, but the door was locked on the inside. A moment was lost while they got a poker and broke it open. Then the creature had already escaped through the window, and the sister, bleeding violently from a wound in the throat, was lying unconscious over the side of the bed. One brother pursued the creature, which fled before him through the moonlight with gigantic strides, and eventually seemed to disappear over the wall into the churchyard. He then rejoined his brother by his sister's bedside. She was dreadfully hurt, and her wound was a very definite one, but she was of strong disposition, not even given to romance or superstition, and when she came to herself, she said, "What has happened is most extraordinary, and I am very much hurt. It seems inexplicable, but of course there is an explanation, and we must wait for it. It will turn out that a lunatic has escaped some asylum and found his way here." The wound healed, and she appeared to get well, but the doctor, who was sent for to her, would not believe that she could bear so terrible a shock so easily, and insisted that she must have change, mental and physical, so her brothers took her to Switzerland. Being a sensible girl, when she went abroad, she threw herself at once into the interests of the country she was in. She dried plants, she made sketches, she went up mountains, and as autumn came on, she was the person who urged that they should return to Crogland Grange. "We have taken it," she said, "for 7 years, and we have only been here 1, and we shall always find it difficult to let a house which is only 1 story high, so we had better return there. Lunatics do not escape every day." As she urged it, her brothers wished nothing better, and the family returned to Cumberland. From there being no upstairs in the house, it was impossible to make any great change in their arrangements. The sister occupied the same room, but it is unnecessary to say that she always closed the shutters, which, however, as in many old houses, always left one top pane of the window uncovered. The brothers moved and occupied a room together, exactly opposite that of their sister, and they always kept loaded pistols in the room. The winter passed most peacefully and happily. In the following March, the sister was suddenly awakened by a sound she remembered only too well. Scratch, scratch, scratch upon the window, and looking up, she saw, climbed up to the topmost pane of the window, the same hideous, brown, shriveled face, with glaring eyes, looking in at her. This time she screamed as loud as she could. Her brothers rushed out of their rooms with the pistols, and out the front door. The creature was already scudding away across the lawn. One of the brothers fired and hit it in the leg, but still with the other leg it continued to make away, scrambled over the wall into the churchyard, and seemed to disappear into a vault, which belonged to a family long extinct. The next day the brothers summoned all the tenants of Crogland Grange, and in their presence the vault was opened. A horrible scene revealed itself. The vault was full of coffins. They had been broken open, and their contents, horribly mangled and distorted, were scattered over the floor. One coffin alone remained intact. Of that the lid had been lifted, but still lay loose upon the coffin. They raised it, and there, brown, withered, shriveled, mummified, but quite entire, was the same hideous figure which had looked in at the windows of Crogland Grange, with the marks of a recent pistol shot in the leg, and they did the only thing that can lay a vampire. They burnt it. Through the windows of Jim Daly's saloon in a little town, the setting sun streamed in yellow patches, lighting up the glasses scattered on the tables and the faces of several men who were gathered near the bar. Farmers mostly they were, with a sprinkling of shopkeepers, while prominent among them was the village editor, and all were discussing a startling piece of news that had spread through the town and its surroundings. The tidings that Walter Stedman, a laborer on Albert Kelsey's ranch, had assaulted and murdered his employer's daughter, had reached them and had spread universal horror among the people. A farmer declared that he had seen the deed committed as he walked through the neighboring lane, and, having always been noted for his cowardice, instead of running to the girl's aid, had hailed a party of miners who were returning from their midday meal through a field nearby. When they reached the spot, however, where Stedman, as they supposed, had done his black deed, only the girl lay there in stillness of death. Her murderer had taken the opportunity to fly. The party had searched the woods of Kelsey Estate, and just as they were nearing the house itself, the appearance of Walter Stedman, walking in a strangely unsteady manner toward it, made them quicken their pace. He was soon in custody, although he had protested his innocence in the crime. He said that he had just seen the body himself on the way to the station, and that when they had found him he was going to the house for help. But they had laughed at his story and had flung him into the tiny, stifling calaboose of the town. What were their proofs? Walter Stedman, a young fellow of about 26, had come from the city to their quiet town just when times were at their hardest, in search of work. The most of the men living in the town were honest fellows, doing their work faithfully when they could get it, and when they had socially asked Stedman to have a drink with them, he had refused in a rather scornful manner. That infernal city chap, he was called, and their hate and envy increased in strength when Albert Kelsey had employed him in preference to any of themselves. As time went on, the story of Stedman's admiration for Margaret Kelsey had gone afloat, and with the added information that his employer's daughter had repulsed him, saying that she would not marry a common laborer. So Stedman, when this news reached his employer's ears, was discharged, and this, then, was his revenge. For them, these proofs were sufficient to pronounce him guilty. Yet that afternoon, as Stedman, crouched on the floor of the calaboose, grew hopeless in the knowledge that no one would believe his story, and that his undeserved punishment would be swift and sure, a tramp, boarding a freight car several miles from the town, sped away from the spot where his crime had been committed, and knew that forever its shadow would follow him. From the tiny window of his prison, Walter Stedman could see the red glow of the heavens that betokened the setting of the sun. So the red sun of his life was soon to set, a life that had been innocent of all crime, and that now was to be ended for a deed that he had never committed. Most prominent of all the visions that swept through his mind was that of Margaret Kelsey, lying as he had first found her, fresh from the hands of her murderer. But there was another of a more tender nature. How long he and Margaret had tried to keep their secret, until Walter could be promoted to a higher position, so that he could ask for her hand with no fear of the father's antagonism. Then came the remembrance of an afternoon meeting between the two in the woods of the Kelsey estate. How, just as they were parting, Walter had heard footsteps near them, and, glancing sharply around, saw an evil, scowling, murderous face peering through the brush. He had started toward it, but the owner of the countenance had taken himself hurriedly off. The gossiping town people had misconstrued this romance, and when Albert Kelsey had heard of this clandestine meeting from the man who was later on to appear as the leader of a mob, that he had discharged Stedman, that they had believed that the young man had formally proposed and had been rejected, but justice had gone wrong, as it had done innumerable times before, and will again. An innocent man was to be hanged, even without the comfort of a trial, while the man who was guilty was free to wander where he could. That autumn night the darkness came quickly, and only the stars did their best to light the scene. A body of men, all masked, and having as a leader one who had ever since Stedman's arrival in town cherished a secret hatred of the young man, dragged Stedman from the calaboose, and tramped through the town, defying all, defying even God himself. Along the highway and into Farmer Brown's cross-cut they went, vigilantly guarding their prisoner, who, with the lanterns lighting up his haggard face, walked among them with the lagging step of utter hopelessness. "That's a good tree," their leader said, presently, stopping and pointing out to a spreading oak. When the slipknot was adjusted and Stedman had stepped on the box, he added, "If you've got anything to say, you better say it now." "I am innocent, I swear before God," the doomed man answered. "I never took the life of Margaret Kelsey." "Give us your proof," jeered the leader, and when Stedman kept a despairing silence, he laughed shortly. "Ready, men!" he gave the order. The box was kicked aside, and then only a writhing body hung to and fro from the gloom. In front of the men stood their leader, watching the contortions of the body with silent glee. "I'll tell you a secret, boys," he said suddenly. "I was after that poor murdered girl myself. A damn little chance I had. But, by God, he had just as little." A pause, then, "He shunted this earth. Cut him down, you fellows." "It's no use, son. I'll give up the blasted thing as a bad job. There's something queer about that there tree. Do you see how its branches balance out? We have cut the trunk nearly in two, but it won't come down. There's plenty of others around. We'll take one of them. If I'd a long rope with me, I'd get that tree down. And yet the way the thing stands, it would be a risking a fellow's life to climb it. It's got the devil in it, sure." So old Farmer Brown shouldered his axe and made for another tree, his son following. They had sawed and chopped and sawed, and yet the tall white oak, with its branches jutting out almost as regularly as if done by the work of a machine, stood straight and firm. Farmer Brown, well known for his weak, cowardly spirit, who, in beholding the murder of Albert Kelsey's daughter, had in his fright mistaken the criminal, now in his superstition let the oak stand, because its well-balanced position saved it from falling, when other trees would have been down. And so this tree, the same one to which an innocent man had been hanged, was left for other work. It was a bleak, rainy night, such a night as can be found only in Central California. The wind howled like 1,000 demons, and lashed the trees together in wild embraces. Now and then the weird hoot-hoot of an owl came softly in from the distance in the lulls of the storm, while the barking of coyotes woke the echoes of the hills into sounds like fiendish laughter. In the wind and rain, a man fought his path through the bush and into Farmer Brown's cross-cut as the shortest way home. Suddenly he stopped, trembling, as if held by some unseen impulse. Before him rose the white oak, wavering and swaying in the storm. "Good God, it's the tree I swung Stedman from," he cried, and a strange fear thrilled him. His eyes were fixed on it, held by some undefinable fascination. Yes, there on one of the longest branches a small piece of rope still dangled, and then, to the murderer's excited vision, this rope seemed to lengthen, to form at the end into a slip knot, a knot that encircled a purple neck, while below it writhed and swayed the body of a man. "Damn him," he muttered, starting toward the hanging form, as if about to help the rope in its work of strangulation. "Will he forever follow me? And yet he deserved it, the black-hearted villain. He took her life." He never finished the sentence. The white oak, towering above him in its strength, seemed to glow like a frenzied living creature. There was a sudden splitting sound, then came a crash, and under the fallen tree lay Stedman's murderer, crushed and mangled. From between the broken trunk and the stump that was left, a gray, dim shape sprang out and sped past the man's still form, away into the wild blackness of the night. The night was hot and overcast, the sky red-rimmed with the lingering sunset of midsummer. They sat at the open window, trying to fancy the air was fresher there. The trees and shrubs of the garden stood stiff and dark. Beyond, in the roadway, gas lamp burnt, bright orange against the hazy blue of the evening. Further were the 3 lights of the railway signal against the lowering sky. The man and woman spoke to one another in low tones. "He does not suspect?" said the man a little nervously. "Not he," she said peevishly, as though it too irritated her. "He thinks of nothing but the works and the prices of fuel. He has no imagination, no poetry. None of these men of iron have," he said sententiously. "They have no hearts." "He has not," she said. She turned her discontented face towards the window. The distant sound of a roaring and rushing drew nearer and grew in volume. The house quivered. One heard the metallic rattle of the tinder. As the train passed, there was a glare of light above the cutting and driving tumult of smoke. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 black oblong 8 trucks passed across the dim gray of the embankment,
and were suddenly extinguished one by one in the throat of the tunnel, which, with the last, seemed to swallow down drain, smoke, and the sound of one abrupt gulp. "This country was all fresh and beautiful once," he said, "and now it is Gehenna. Down that way, nothing but pot banks and chimneys belching fire and dust into the face of heaven. But what does it matter? An end comes, an end to all this cruelty. Tomorrow." He spoke the last word in a whisper. "Tomorrow," she said, speaking in a whisper too, and still staring out of the window. "Dear," he said, putting his hand on hers. She turned with a start, and their eyes searched one another's. Hers softened to his gaze. "My dear one," she said, and then, "It seems so strange that you should have come into my life like this. To open," she paused. "To open?" he said. "All this wonderful world," she hesitated and spoke still more softly. "This world of love to me." Then suddenly, the door clicked and closed. They turned their heads, and he started violently back. In the shadow of the room stood a great shadowy figure, silent. They saw the face dimly in the half-light, with unexpressive dark patches under the penthouse brows. Every muscle in Rout's body suddenly became tense. When could the door have opened? What had he heard? Had he heard all? What had he seen? A tumult of questions. The newcomer's voice came at last, after a pause that seemed interminable. "Well?" he said. "I was afraid I had missed you, Horrocks," said the man at the window, gripping the window ledge with his hand. His voice was unsteady. The clumsy figure of Horrocks came forward out of the shadow. He made no answer to Rout's remark. For a moment he stood above them. The woman's heart was cold within her. "I told Mr. Rout it was just possible you might come back," she said, in a voice that never quivered. Horrocks, still silent, sat down abruptly in the chair by her little work table. His big hands were clenched. One saw now the fire of his eyes under the shadow of his brows. He was trying to get his breath. His eyes went from the woman he had trusted to the friend he had trusted, and then back to the woman. By this time, and for the moment, all three half understood one another, yet none dared to say a word to ease the pent-up things that choked them. It was the husband's voice that broke the silence at last. "You wanted to see me?" he said to Rout. Rout started as he spoke. "I came to see you," he said, resolved to lie to the last. "Yes?" said Horrocks. "You promised," said Rout, "to show me some fine effects of moonlight and smoke." "I promised to show you some fine effects of moonlight and smoke," repeated Horrocks in a colorless voice. "And I thought I might catch you tonight before you went down to the works," proceeded Rout, "and come with you." There was another pause. Did the man mean to take the thing coolly? Did he after all know? How long had he been in the room? Yet even at the moment when they heard the door, their attitudes, Horrocks glanced at the profile of the woman, shadowy pallid in the half-light. Then he glanced at Rout and seemed to recover himself suddenly. "Of course," he said. "I promised to show you the works under the proper dramatic conditions. It's odd how I could have forgotten." "If I'm troubling you," began Rout. Horrocks started again. A new light had suddenly come into the sultry gloom of his eyes. "Not in the least," he said. "Have you been telling Mr. Rout all of these contrasts of flame and shadow you think so splendid?" said the woman, turning now to her husband for the first time, her confidence creeping back again, her voice just one half note too high. "That dreadful theory of yours that machinery is beautiful and everything else in the world is ugly. I thought he would not spare you, Mr. Rout. It's his great theory, his one discovery in art." "I am slow to make discoveries," said Horrocks, grimly, damping her suddenly. "But what I discover—" He stopped. "Well," she said. "Nothing," and suddenly he rose to his feet. "I promised to show you the works," he said to Rout, and put his big clumsy hand on his friend's shoulder. "And you are ready to go?" "Quite," said Rout, and stood up also. There was another pause. Each of them peered through the indistinctness of the dusk at the other two. Horrocks' hand still rested on Rout's shoulder. Rout half fancied still that the incident was trivial after all. But Mrs. Horrocks knew her husband better, knew that grim quiet in his voice, and the confusion in her mind took vague shape of a physical evil. "Very well," said Horrocks, and dropping his hand, turned towards the door. "My hat?" Rout looked around in the half-light. "That's my work basket," said Mrs. Horrocks, with a gust of hysterical laughter. The hands came together on the back of the chair. "Here it is," he said. She had an impulse to warn him in an undertone, but she could not frame a word. "Don't go," and "beware of him," struggled in her mind, and the swift moment passed. "Got it?" said Horrocks, standing with the door half open. Rout stepped towards him. "Better say goodbye to Mrs. Horrocks," said the ironmaster, even more grimly quiet in his tone than before. Rout started and turned. "Good evening, Mrs. Horrocks," he said, and their hands touched. Horrocks held the door open with a ceremonial politeness unusual in him towards men. Rout went out, and then, after a wordless look at her, her husband followed. She stood motionless while Rout's light footfall and her husband's heavy tread, like bass and treble, passed down the passageway together. The front door slammed heavily. She went to the window, moving slowly, and stood watching, leaning forward. The two men appeared for a moment at the gateway in the road, passed under the street lamp, and were hidden by the black masses of the shrubbery. The lamplight fell for a moment on their faces, showing only unmeaning pale patches, telling nothing of what she still feared and doubted and craved vainly to know. Then she sank down into a crouching attitude in the big armchair, her eyes wide open and staring out at the red lights from the furnace that flickered in the sky. An hour after she was still there, her attitude scarcely changed. The oppressive stillness of the evening weighed heavily upon Rout. They went side by side down the road in silence, and in silence turned into the cinder-made byway that presently opened out to the prospect of the valley. A blue haze, half dust, half mist, touched the long valley with mystery. Beyond were Hanley and Etruria, gray and dark masses, outlined thinly by the rare golden dots of the street lamps, and here and there a gaslit window, or the yellow glare of some late working factory or a crowded public house. Out of the masses, clear and slender against the evening sky, rose a multitude of tall chimneys, many of them reeking, a few smokeless during the season of play. Here and there, a pallid patch and ghostly stunted beehive shapes showed the position of a pot pank, or a wheel, black and sharp against the hot lower sky, marked some colliery where they raised the iridescent coal of the place. Nearer at hand was the broad stretch of railway, and half-visible trains shunted, a steady puffing and rumbling, with every run a ringing concussion, and a rhythmic series of impacts, and a passage of intermittent puffs of white steam across the further view. And to the left, between the railway and the dark mass of the low hill beyond, dominating the whole view, colossal, inky black, and crowned with smoke and fitful flames, stood the great cylinders of the Jeddah Company blast furnaces, the central edifices of the big ironworks of which Horrocks was the manager. They stood heavy and threatening, full of an incandescent turmoil of flames and seething molten iron, and about the feet of them rattled the rolling mills, and the steam hammer beat heavily and splashed the white-hot iron sparks hither and thither. Even as they looked, a truck full of fuel was shot into one of the giants, and red flames gleamed out, and a concussion of smoke and black dust came boiling upwards towards the sky. "Certainly you get some fine effects of color with your furnaces," said Rout, breaking a silence that had become apprehensive. Horrocks grunted. He stood with his hands in his pockets, frowning down at the dim steaming railway and the busy ironworks beyond, frowning as if he were thinking out some knotty problem. Rout glanced at him and away again. "At present your moonlight effect is hardly ripe," he continued, looking upward. "The moon is still smothered by the vestiges of daylight." Horrocks stared at him with an expression of a man who has suddenly awakened. "Vestiges of daylight, of course. He too looked up at the moon, pale still in the midsummer sky. "Come along," he said suddenly, and, gripping Rout's arm in his hand, made a move towards the path that dropped from them towards the railway. Rout hung back, their eyes met, and saw 1,000 things in a moment that their lips came near to say. Oryx's hand tightened and then relaxed. He let go, and before Rout was aware, they were arm in arm and walking, one unwillingly enough, down the path. "You see the fine effect of the railway signals towards Burslem," said Horrocks, suddenly breaking into loquacity, striding fast and tightening the grip of his elbow the while. "Little green lights and red and white lights all against the haze. You have an eye for effect, Rout. It's a fine effect. And look at those furnaces of mine, how they rise upon us as we come downhill. That to the right is my pet, 70 feet of him. I packed him myself, and he's boiled away cheerfully with iron in his guts for 5 long years. I've a particular fancy for him. That line of red there, a lovely bit of warm orange you'd call it, Rout, that's the puddler's furnace. And there, in the hot light, 3 black figures. Did you see the white splash of the steam hammer then? That's the rolling mills. Come along. Clang, clatter, how it goes rattling across the floor. Sheet tin, Rout. Amazing stuff. Glass mirrors are not in it when that stuff comes from the mill. And squelch, there goes the hammer again. Come along." He had to stop talking to catch at his breath. His arm twisted into Rout's with benumbing tightness. He had come striding down the black path towards the railway as though he was possessed. Rout had not spoken a word, had simply hung back against Horrocks' pull with all his strength. "I say," he said now, laughing nervously, but with an undertone of a snarl in his voice, "why on earth are you nipping my arm off, Horrocks, and dragging me along like this?" At length Horrocks released him. His manner changed again. "Nipping your arm off," he said. "Sorry, but it's you taught me the trick of walking in that friendly way. You haven't learned the refinements of it yet, then," said Rout, laughing artificially again. "By Jove, I'm black and blue." Horrocks offered no apology. They stood now near the bottom of the hill, close to the fence that bordered the railway. The ironworks had grown larger and spread out with their approach. They looked up to the blast furnaces now instead of down. The further view of Etruria and Hanley had dropped out of sight with their descent. Before them, by the stile, rose a notice board, bearing, still dimly visible, the words "Beware of the trains," half hidden by splashes of coaly mud. "Fine effects," said Horrocks, waving his arm. "Here comes a train. The puffs of smoke, the orange glare, the round eye of light in front of it, the melodious rattle. Fine effects. But these furnaces of mine used to be finer, before we shoved cones in their throats and saved the gas." "How?" said Rout. "Cones?" "Cones, my man, cones. I'll show you one nearer. The flames used to flare out of the open throats. Great. What is it? Pillars of cloud by day, red and black smoke, and pillars of fire by night. Now we run it off in pipes and burn it to heat the blast, and the top is shut by a cone. You'll be interested in that cone. But every now and then," said Rout, "you get a burst of fire and smoke up there. The cone's not fixed. It's hung by a chain from a lever and balanced by an equipoise. You should see it nearer, else, of course, there'd be no way of getting fuel into the thing. Every now and then the cone dips and out comes the flare." "I see," said Rout. He looked over his shoulder. "The moon gets brighter," he said. "Come along," said Horrocks, abruptly, gripping his shoulder again and moving him suddenly towards the railway crossing. And then came one of those swift incidents, vivid but so rapid that they leave one doubtful and reeling. Halfway across, Horrocks' hand suddenly clenched upon him like a vice and swung him backward and through a half-turn so that he looked up the line. And there a chain of lamplit carriage windows telescoped swiftly as it came towards them, and the red and yellow lights of an engine grew larger and larger, rushing down upon them. As he grasped what this meant, he turned his face to Horrocks and pushed with all his strength against the arm that held him back between the rails. The struggle did not last a moment, discertain as it was that Horrocks held him there, So certain was it that he had been violently lugged out of danger. "Out of the way," said Horrocks with a gasp as the train came rattling by, and they stood panting by the gate into the ironworks. "I did not see it coming," said Rout, still, even in spite of his own apprehensions, trying to keep up an appearance of ordinary intercourse. Horrocks answered with a grunt. "The cone," he said, and then, as one who recovers himself, "I thought you did not hear." "I didn't," said Rout. "I wouldn't have had you run over then for the world," said Horrocks. "For a moment I lost my nerve," said Rout. Horrocks stood for a half-minute, then turned abruptly towards the ironworks again. "See how fine these great mounds of mine, these clinker heaps, look in the night. That truck yonder, up above there, up it goes, and out tilts the slag. See the palpitating red stuff go sliding down the slope. As we get nearer, the heap rises up and cuts the blast furnaces. See the quiver up above the big one? Not that way, this way, between the block heaps. That goes to the puddling furnaces, but I want to show you the canal first." Came and took Rout by the elbow, and so they went along side by side. Rout answered Horrocks vaguely. What, he asked himself, had really happened on the line? Was he deluding himself with his own fancies, or had Horrocks actually held him back in the way of the train? Had he just been within ace of being murdered? Suppose this slouching, scowling monster did know anything. For a minute or two then, Rout was really afraid for his life, but the mood passed as he reasoned with himself. After all, Horrocks might have heard nothing. At any rate, he had pulled him out of the way in time. His odd manner might be due to mere vague jealousy he had shown once before. He was talking now of the ash heaps and the canal. "Eh?" said Horrocks. "What?" said Rout. "Rather. The haze in the moonlight. Fine." "Our canal," said Horrocks, stopping suddenly. "Our canal by moonlight and firelight is an immense effect. You've never seen it? Fancy that. You've spent so many of your evenings philandering up in Newcastle there, I tell you, for real florid effects, but you shall see. Boiling water." As they came out of the labyrinth of clinker heaps and mounds of coal and ore, the noises of the rolling mill sprang upon them suddenly, loud, near, and distinct. 3 shadowy workmen went by and touched their caps to Horrocks. Their faces were vague in the darkness. Rout felt a futile impulse to address them, and before he could frame his words, they passed into the shadows. Horrocks pointed to the canal close before them now, a weird-looking place it seemed, in the blood-red reflections of the furnace. The hot water that cooled the 2 years came into it, some 50 yards up, a tumultuous, almost boiling affluent, and the steam rose up from the water in silent white wisps and streaks, wrapping damply about them, an incessant succession of ghosts coming up from the black and red eddies, a white uprising that made the head swim. The shining black tower of the larger blast furnace rose overhead out of the mist, and its tumultuous riot filled their ears. Rout kept away from the edge of the water and watched Horrocks. "Here it is red," said Horrocks, "blood-red vapor as red and hot as sin, but yonder there, where the moonlight falls on it and it drives across the clinker heaps, it is white as death." Rout turned his head for a moment, and then came back hastily to his watch on Horrocks. "Come along to the rolling mills," said Horrocks. The threatening hold was not so evident that time, and Rout felt a little reassured. But all the same, what on earth did Horrocks mean about white as death and red as sin? Coincidence, perhaps? They went and stood behind the puddlers for a little while, and then through the rolling mills, where amidst an incessant din, a deliberate steam hammer beat the juice out of the succulent iron, and black, half-naked titans rushed the plastic bars, like hot sealing wax, between the wheels. "Come on," said Horrocks in Rout's ear, and they went and peeped through the little glass hole behind the tires, and saw the tumbled fire writhing in the pit of the blast furnace. It left one eye blinded for a while. Then, with green and blue patches dancing across the dark, they went to the lift by which the trucks of ore and fuel and lime were raised to the top of the big cylinder, and out upon the narrow rail that overhung the furnace. Rout's doubts came upon him again. Was it wise to be here? If Horrocks did know everything, do what he would, he could not resist a violent trembling. Right underfoot was a sheer depth of 70 feet. It was a dangerous place. They pushed by a truck of fuel to get to the railing that crowned the place. The reek of the furnace, a sulphurous vapor streaked with pungent bitterness, seemed to make the distant hillside of Hanley quiver. The moon was riding out now from among the drifts of clouds, halfway up the sky above the undulating wooded outlines of Newcastle. The steaming canal ran away from below them under an indistinct bridge and vanished into the dim haze of the flat fields towards Burslem. "That's the cone I've been telling you of," shouted Horrocks, "and below that 60 feet of fire and molten metal, with the air of the blast frothing through it like gas in soda water." Rout gripped the handrail tightly and stared down at the cone. The heat was intense. The boiling of the iron and the tumult of the blast made a thunderous accompaniment to Horrocks' voice. But the thing had to be gone through now, perhaps, after all. "In the middle," bawled Horrocks, "temperature near 1,000 degrees. If you were dropped into it, flash into the flame like a pinch of gunpowder in a candle. Put your hand out and feel the heat of his breath. Why, even up here, I've seen the rainwater boiling off the trucks. And that cone there, it's a damn sight too hot for roasting cakes. The top side of it is 300 degrees. 300 degrees, said Rout. 300 centigrade, mind, said Horrocks. It will boil the blood out of you in no time. Eh? Said Rout, and turned. Boil the blood out of you in... No, you don't. Let me go, screamed Rout. Let go of my arm. With one hand he clutched at the handrail, then with both. For a moment the two men stood swaying, then suddenly, with a violent jerk, Horrocks had twisted him from his hold. He clutched at Horrocks and missed. His foot went back into empty air. In mid-air he twisted himself, and then cheek and shoulder and knee struck the hot cone together. He clutched the chain by which the cone hung, and the thing sank an infinitesimal amount as he struck it. A circle of glowing red appeared about him, and a tongue of flame, released from the chaos within, flickered up towards him. An intense pain assailed him at the knees, and he could smell the singeing of his hands. He raised himself to his feet and tried to climb up the chain, and then something struck his head. Black and shining with the moonlight, the throat of the furnace rose about him. Horrocks, he saw, stood above him by one of the trucks of fuel on the rail. The gesticulating figure was bright and white in the moonlight and shouting, "Fizzle, you fool! Fizzle, you hunter of women! You hot-blooded hound! Boil, boil, boil!" Suddenly he caught up a handful of coal out of the truck and flung it deliberately, lump after lump, at Rout. "Horrocks!" cried Rout. "Horrocks!" He clung crying to the chain, pulling himself up from the burning of the cone. Each missile Horrocks flung hit him. His clothes charred and glowed, and as he struggled the cone dropped and rush of hot, suffocating gas whooped out and burned around him in a swift breath of flame. His human likeness departed from him. When the momentary red had passed, Horrocks saw a charred, blackened figure, its head streaked with blood, still clutching and fumbling with the chain and writhing in agony, a cindery animal, inhuman, monstrous creature that began sobbing intermittent shriek. Abruptly at the sight, the Ironmaster's anger passed. A deadly sickness came upon him. The heavy odor of burning flesh came drifting up to his nostrils. His sanity returned to him. "God have mercy upon me," he cried. "God, oh God, what have I done?" He knew the thing below him, save that it still moved and felt, was already a dead man, that the blood of the poor wretch must be boiling in his veins. An intense realization of that agony came to his mind and overcame every other feeling. For a moment he stood irresolute, and then, turning to the truck, he hastily tilted its contents upon the struggling thing that had once been a man. The mass fell with a thud and went radiating over the cone. With the thud the shriek ended, and a boiling confusion of smoke, dust, and flame came rushing up towards him. As it passed, he saw the cone clear again. Then he staggered back and stood trembling, clinging to the rail with both hands. His lips moved, but no words came to them. Down below was the sound of voices and rushing steps. The clangor of rolling in the shed ceased abruptly. It was the middle of November when we arrived at Martingale and found the place anything but romantic or pleasant. The walks were wet and sodden, the trees were leafless, there were no flowers save a few late pink roses blooming in the garden. It had been a wet season, and the place looked miserable. Claire would not ask Alice down to keep her company in the winter months, as she had intended, and for myself, the Cronsons were still absent in New Norfolk, where they were meant to spend Christmas with old Mrs. Cronson, now recovered. Altogether, Martingale seemed dreary enough, and the ghost stories we had laughed at while sunshine flooded the room became less unreal when we had nothing but blazing fires and wax candles to dispel the gloom. They became more real also when servant after servant left us to seek situations elsewhere, when noises grew frequent in the house, when we ourselves, Claire and I, with our own ears heard the tramp, tramp, the banging and chattering which had been described to us. My dear reader, you doubtless are free from superstitious fancies. You pooh-pooh the existence of ghosts and only wish you could find a haunted house in which to spend a night, which is all very brave and praiseworthy, but wait till you are left in a dreary, desolate old country mansion, filled with the most unaccountable sounds, without a servant, with none save an old caretaker and his wife, who, living at the extremest end of the building, heard nothing of the tramp, tramp, bang, bang, going on at all hours of the night. At first I imagined the noises were produced by some evil-disposed persons who wished, for purposes of their own, to keep the house uninhabited, but by degrees Claire and I came to the conclusion the visitation must be supernatural, and Martingale by consequence untenable. Still being practical people, unlike our predecessors, and not having money to live where and how we liked, we decided to watch and see whether we could trace any human influence in the matter. If not, it was agreed we were to pull down the right wing of the house and the principal staircase. For nights and nights we sat up till 2 or 3 o'clock in the morning, Claire engaged in needlework, I reading, with a revolver lying on the table beside me, but nothing, neither sound nor appearance rewarded our vigil. This confirmed my first ideas that the sounds were not supernatural, but just to test the matter, I determined on Christmas Eve, the anniversary of Mr. Jeremy Lester's disappearance, to keep watch myself in the red bedchamber. Even to Claire I never mentioned my intention. About 10, tired out with our previous vigils, we each retired to rest. Somewhat ostentatiously, perhaps, I noisily shut the door of my room, and when I opened it half an hour afterwards, no mouse could have pursued its way along the corridor with greater silence and caution than myself. Quite in the dark, I sat in the red room. For over an hour I might as well have been in my grave for anything I could see in the apartment. But at the end of that time the moon rose and cast strange lights across the floor and upon the wall of the haunted chamber. Hitherto I kept my watch opposite the window. Now I changed my place to a corner near the door, where I was shaded from observation by the heavy hangings of the bed and the antique wardrobe. Still I sat on, but still no sound broke the silence. I was weary with many nights watching, and tired of my solitary vigil. I dropped at last into a slumber from which I awakened by hearing the door softly opened. "John," said my sister, almost in a whisper. "John, are you here?" "Yes, Claire," I answered. "But what are you doing up at this hour?" "Come downstairs," she replied. "They are in the oak parlor." I did not need any explanation as to whom she meant, but crept downstairs after her, warned by an uplifted hand of the necessity for silence and caution. By the open door of the oak parlor, she paused, and we both looked in. There was the room we left in darkness overnight, with a bright wood fire blazing on the hearth, candles on the chimney piece, the small table pulled out from its accustomed corner, and 2 men seated beside it, playing at cribbage. We could see the face of the younger player. It was that of a man of about 25, of a man who had lived hard and wickedly, who had wasted his substance and his health, who had been, while in the flesh, Jeremy Lester. It would be difficult for me to say how I knew this, how in a moment I identified the features of the player with those of the man who had been missing for 41 years that very night. He was dressed in the costume of a bygone period. His hair was powdered, and round his wrists there were ruffles of lace. He looked like one who, having come from some great party, had sat down after his return home to play cards with an intimate friend. On his little finger there sparkled a ring. In the front of his shirt there gleamed a valuable diamond. There were diamond buckles in his shoes, and according to the fashion of his time, he wore knee breeches and silk stockings, which showed off advantageously the shape of a remarkably good leg and ankle. He sat opposite the door, but never once lifted his eyes to it. His attention seemed concentrated on the cards. For a time there was utter silence in the room, broken only by the momentous counting of the game. In the doorway we stood, holding our breath, terrified and yet fascinated by the scene which was being acted before us. The ashes dropped on the hearth softly, and like the snow, we could hear the rustle of the cards as they were dealt out and fell upon the table. We listened to the count, 15-2, 15-4, and so forth, but there was no other word spoken till at length the player, whose face we could not see, exclaimed, "I win, the game is mine." Then his opponent took up the cards, sorted over them negligently in his hand, put them close together, and flung the whole pack in his guest's face, exclaiming, "Cheat, liar, take that." There was a bustle and confusion, a flinging over of chairs, and fierce gesticulation, and such a noise of passionate voices mingling, that we could not hear a sentence which was uttered. All at once, however, Jeremy Lester strode out of the room in so great a hurry that he almost touched us where we stood. Out of the room, and tramp, tramp up the staircase to the Red Room, whence he descended in a few minutes with a couple of rapiers under his arm. When he re-entered the room he gave, as it seemed to us, the other man his choice of the weapons, and then he flung open the window, and after ceremoniously giving place for his opponent to pass out first, he walked forth into the night air, Claire and I following. We went through the garden and down a narrow winding walk to a smooth piece of turf, sheltered from the north by a plantation of young fir trees. It was a bright moonlit night by this time, and we could distinctly see Jeremy Lester measuring off the ground. "When you say 3, he said at last to the man whose back was still towards us. They had drawn lots for the ground, and a lot had fallen against Mr. Lester. He stood thus with the moonbeams falling upon him, and a handsomer fellow I would never desire to behold. 1, began the other. 2, and before our kinsman had the slightest suspicion of his design, he was upon him, and his rapier through Jeremy Lester's breast. At the sight of that cowardly treachery, Claire screamed aloud. In a moment the combatants had disappeared. The moon was obscured behind a cloud, and we were standing in the shadow of the fir plantation, shivering with cold and terror. But we knew at last what had become of the late owner of Martingdale, that he had fallen, not in a fair fight, but foully murdered by a false friend. When late on Christmas morning I awoke, it was to see a white world, to behold the ground and the trees and shrubs all laden and covered with snow. There was snow everywhere, such snow as no person could remember having fallen for 41 years. It was on just such a Christmas as this that Mr. Jeremy disappeared, remarked the old sexton to my sister, who had insisted on dragging me through the snow to church, whereupon Claire fainted away and was carried into the vestry, where I made full confession to the vicar of all we had beheld the previous night. At first that worthy individual rather inclined to treat the matter lightly, but when, a fortnight after, the snow melted away and the fir plantation came to be examined, he confessed there might be more things in heaven and earth than his limited philosophy had dreamed of. In a little clear space just within the plantation, Jeremy Lester's body was found. We knew it by the ring and the diamond buckles and the sparkling breastpin, and Mr. Cronson, who in his capacity as magistrate came over to inspect these relics, was visibly perturbed at my narrative. "Pray, Mr. Lester, did you in your dream see the face of the gentleman, your kinsman's opponent?" "No," I answered. "He sat and stood with his back to us all the time." "There is nothing more, of course, to be done in the matter," observed Mr. Cronson. "Nothing," I replied, and the affair would doubtless have terminated, but that a few days afterwards, when we were dining at Cronson Park, Claire all of a sudden dropped the glass of water she was carrying to her lips, and exclaimed, "Look, John, there he is," rose from her seat, and with a face as white as a tablecloth, pointed to a portrait hanging on the wall. I saw him for an instant when he turned his head towards the door as Jeremy Lester left it, she explained. That is he. Of what followed after this identification, I have only the vaguest recollection. Servants rushed hither and thither. Mrs. Cronson dropped off her chair in hysterics. The young ladies gathered around their mamma. Mr. Cronson, trembling like one in an ague fit, attempted some kind of explanation, while Claire kept praying to be taken away, only to be taken away. I took her away, not merely from Cronson Park, but from Martingdale. Before we left the latter place, however, I had an interview with Mr. Cronson, who said the portrait Claire had identified was that of his wife's father, the last person who saw Jeremy Lester alive. He is an old man now, finished Mr. Cronson, a man over 80 who had confessed everything to me. You won't bring further sorrow and disgrace upon us by making this matter public. I promised him I would keep silent, but the story gradually oozed out, and the Cronsons left the country. My sister never returned to Martingdale. She married and is living in London. Though I assure her there are no strange noises in my house, she will not visit Bedfordshire, where the little girl she wanted me so long ago to think of seriously is now my wife and mother of my children.
A long time ago, and at a considerable distance from any town, there lived a gentleman who was not only in possession of great riches, but of the largest estates in that part of the country. Although he had some very elegant, neat mansions on his estates, he generally resided in a magnificent castle, beautifully situated on a rising ground, surrounded with groves of the finest evergreens, and other choice trees and shrubs. The inside of this fine castle was even more beautiful than the outside, for the rooms were all hung with the richest damask, curiously ornamented. The chairs and sofas were covered with the finest velvet, fringed with gold, and his table dishes and plates were either of silver or gold, finished in the most elegant style. His carriages and horses might have served a king, and perhaps were finer than any monarchs of the present day. The gentleman's appearance, however, did not altogether correspond to his wealth, for, to a fierce, disagreeable countenance, was added an ugly blue beard, which made him an object of fear and disgust in the neighborhood, where he usually went by the name of Bluebeard. There resided at some considerable distance from Bluebeard's castle an old lady and her 2 daughters, who were people of some rank, but by no means wealthy. The 2 young ladies were very pretty, and the fame of their beauty having reached Bluebeard, he determined to ask one of them in marriage. Having ordered a carriage, he called at their house, where he saw the 2 young ladies, and was very politely received by their mother, with whom he begged for a few moments of conversation. After the 2 young ladies left the room, he began by describing his immense riches, and then told her the purport of his mission, begging she would use her interest in his favor. They were both so lovely, he said, that he would be happy to get either of them for his wife, and would therefore leave it to their own choice to determine upon the subject, and immediately took his leave. When the proposals of Bluebeard were mentioned to the young ladies by their mother, both Miss Anne and her sister Fatima protested that they would never marry an ugly man, and particularly one with such a frightful blue beard, because, although he possessed immense riches, it was reported in the country that he had married several beautiful ladies, and nobody could tell what had become of them. Their mother said that the gentleman was agreeable in his conversation and manners, that the ugliness of his face and the blue beard were defects which they would soon be reconciled to from habit, that his immense riches would procure them every luxury their heart could desire, and he was so civil that she was certain the scandalous reports about his wives must be entirely without foundation. The 2 young ladies were as civil as they could possibly be, in order to conceal the disgust they felt at Bluebeard, and to soften their refusal, replied to this effect, that, at present, they had no desire to change their situation, but if they had, the one sister could never think of depriving the other of so good a match, and that they did not wish to be separated. Bluebeard, having called next day, the old lady told him what her daughters had said, on which he sighed deeply and pretended to be very much disappointed. But as he had the mother on his side, he still continued his visits to the family. Bluebeard, knowing the attractions that fine houses, fine furniture, and fine entertainments have on the minds of ladies in general, invited the mother, her 2 daughters, and 2 or 3 other ladies who were then on a visit to them, to spend a day or 2 with him at his castle. Bluebeard's invitation was accepted, and having spent a considerable time in arranging their wardrobe and in adorning their persons, they all set out for the splendid mansion of Bluebeard. On coming near the castle, although they had heard a great deal of the taste and expense that had been employed in decorating it, they were struck with the beauty of the trees that overshadowed the walks through which they passed, and with the fragrancy of the flowers which perfumed the air. When they reached the castle, Bluebeard, attended by a number of his servants in splendid dresses, received them with the most polite courtesy, and conducted them to a magnificent drawing-room. An elegant repast was ready in the dining-room, to which they adjourned. Here they were again astonished by the grandeur of the apartment and the elegance of the entertainment, and they felt so happy that the evening passed away before they were aware. The next day, after they had finished breakfast, the ladies proceeded to examine the pictures and furniture of the rooms that were open, and were truly astonished at the magnificence that everywhere met their view. The time rolled pleasantly away amidst a succession of the most agreeable amusements, consisting of hunting, music, dancing, and banquets, where the richest wines and the most tempting delicacies and the most luxurious profusion presented themselves in every direction. The party felt so agreeable amidst the scenes of festivity that they continued at the castle several days, during which the cunning Bluebeard, by every obsequious service, tried to gain the favor of his fair guests. Personal attentions, even although paid us by an ugly creature, seldom failed to make a favorable impression. It was therefore no wonder that Fatima, the youngest of the 2 sisters, began to think Bluebeard a very polite, pleasant, and civil gentleman, and that the beard, which she and her sister had been so much afraid of, was not so very blue. A short time after her return home, Fatima, who was delighted with the attention which had been paid to her at the castle, told her mother that she did not now feel any objections to accept Bluebeard as a husband. The old lady immediately communicated to him the change in her daughter's sentiments. Bluebeard, who lost no time in paying the family a visit, was in a few days privately married to the young lady, and soon after the ceremony, Fatima, accompanied by her sister, returned to the castle, the wife of Bluebeard. On arriving there, they were received at the entrance by all his retinue, attired in splendid dresses, and Bluebeard, after saluting his bride, led the way to an elegant entertainment, where everything that could add to their comfort was being prepared. They spent the evening in the most agreeable manner. The next day, and every succeeding day, Bluebeard always varied the amusements, and a month had passed away imperceptibly, when he told his wife that he was obliged to leave her for a few weeks, as he had some affairs to transact in a distant part of the country, which required his personal attendance. "But," he said, "my dear Fatima, you may enjoy yourself in my absence in any way that will add to your happiness, and you can invite your friends to make the time pass more agreeably, for you are sole mistress in this castle. Here are the keys to the 2 large wardrobes. This is the key of the great box that contains the best plate, which we use for company. This of my strong box, where I keep my money, and this belongs to the casket, in which are all my jewels. Here also is the master key to all the rooms in the house, but this small key belongs to the blue closet at the end of the long gallery on the ground floor. I give you leave," he continued, "to open or do what you like with all the rest of the castle except this closet. Now, my dear, remember you must not enter it, nor even put the key into the lock. If you do not obey me in this, expect most dreadful of punishments." She promised him implicit obedience to his orders, and then accompanied him to the gate, where Bluebeard, after saluting her in a tender manner, stepped into the coach and drove away. When Bluebeard was gone, Fatima sent a kind invitation to her friends to come immediately to the castle, and ordered a grand entertainment to be prepared for their reception. She also sent a messenger to her 2 brothers, both officers in the army, who were quartered about 40 miles distant, requesting that they would obtain a leave of absence and spend a few days with her. So eager were her friends to see the apartments and the riches of Bluebeard's castle, of which they had heard so much, that in less than 2 hours after receiving notice, the whole company were assembled, with the exception of her brothers, who were not expected till the following day. As her guests had arrived long before the time appointed them for entertainment, Fatima took them through every apartment in the castle and displayed all the wealth she had acquired by her marriage with Bluebeard. They went from room to room and from wardrobe to wardrobe, expressing fresh wonder and delight at every new object they came to. But their surprise was increased when they entered the drawing rooms and saw the grandeur of the furniture. During the day, Fatima was so much engaged that she never once thought of the blue closet, which Bluebeard had ordered her not to open. But when all the visitors were gone, she felt a great curiosity to know its contents. She took out the key, which was made of the finest gold, and went to consult with her sister on the subject. Anne used every argument she could think of to dissuade Fatima from her purpose. I reminded her of the threats of Bluebeard, but all in vain, for Fatima was now bent on gratifying her curiosity. She therefore, in spite of all her sister could do, seized one of the candles and hurried downstairs to the fatal closet. On reaching the door, she stopped and began to reason with herself on the propriety of her conduct, but her curiosity at length overcame every other consideration, and, with a trembling hand, she applied the key to the lock and opened the door. She had only advanced a few steps when the most frightful scene met her view, and, struck with horror and dismay, she dropped the key of the closet. She was in the midst of blood, and the heads and bodies and mutilated limbs of murdered ladies lay scattered on the floor. These ladies had all been married to Bluebeard, and had suffered for their imprudent curiosity, the key, which was the gift of the fairy, always betraying their fatal disobedience. The terror of Fatima was not diminished on observing these dreadful words on the wall. The reward of disobedience and imprudent curiosity. She trembled violently, but, on recovering a little, she snatched up the key, and having again locked the door, left this abode of horror. As soon as she reached her sister's chamber, she related the whole of her horrid adventure. They then examined the key, but it was all covered with blood, and they both turned pale with fear. They spent a good part of the night in trying to clean off the blood from the key, but it was without effect, for though they washed and scoured it with brick dust and sand, no sooner was the blood removed from one side than it appeared on the other. Fatigued with their exertions, they at last retired to bed, where they passed a sleepless and anxious night. Fatima rose at a late hour the next day, and consulted with her sister how she ought to proceed. She thought first of escaping from the castle, but as her brothers were expected in an hour or two, she resolved to wait until their arrival. A loud knock at the gate made her almost leap for joy, and she cried, "They are come! They are come!" But what was her consternation when Bluebeard hastily opened the door and entered. It was impossible for Fatima to conceal her agitation, although she pretended to be very happy at his sudden and unexpected return. Bluebeard, who guessed what she had been about, requested the keys, in order, as he said, that he might change his dress. She went to her chamber, and soon returned with the keys, all except the one belonging to the blue closet. He took the keys from her with seeming indifference, and after glancing at them minutely, said, rather sternly, "How is this, Fatima? I do not see the key of the blue closet here. Go and bring it to me instantly." The poor girl, feeling the crisis of her fate approaching, said, "I will go and search for it," and left the apartment in tears. She went straight to her sister's chamber, where they again tried, but in vain, to remove the blood from the key. The voice of Bluebeard again calling for her, she was forced to return, and reluctantly give him the fatal key. On examining the key, Bluebeard burst into a terrible rage. "Pray, madam," he said, "how came this blood to be here?" "I am sure I do not know," replied she, trembling and turning pale. "What? Do you not know?" cried Bluebeard, in a voice like thunder, which made poor Fatima start with fear. "But I know well. You have been in the forbidden blue closet, and since you are so fond of prying into secrets, you shall take up your abode with the ladies you saw there." Almost expiring with fear and terror, the trembling Fatima sunk upon her knees, and implored him in the most piteous manner to forgive her. But the cruel Bluebeard, deaf to her entreaties, drew his dreadful scimitar, and bid her to prepare for imminent death. Bluebeard had raised his arm to give the fatal blow, when a dreadful shriek from her sister, who at that moment entered the apartment, arrested his attention. She entreated him to spare the life of Fatima, but he was deaf to her intercession, and would only grant her 1/4 of an hour, that she might make her peace with heaven before he put her to death. Bluebeard then dragged her up to a large hall in the top of the tower of the castle, to prevent her groans being heard, to which they were followed by her sister. He then told her to make the best use of the time, as she might expect his return the moment it elapsed, and immediately left the place. When alone with her sister, Fatima felt her dreadful situation, and again burst into tears. Only 15 minutes between her and the most cruel death, without the least chance of escape, for Bluebeard had secured the door when he retired, and the staircase they saw only led to the battlements. Fatima's thoughts were now turned to her brothers, whom she expected that day, and she requested her sister to ascend to the top of the tower to see if there was any appearance of them. Fatima's sister immediately ascended to the top of the battlements, while the poor trembling girl below, every minute, cried out, "Sister Anne, my dear Sister Anne, do you see anyone coming yet?" Her sister always replied, "There is not a human being in view, and I see nothing but the sun and the grass." She was upon her knees bewailing her fate, when Bluebeard, in a tremulous voice, cried out, "Are you ready? The time is expired." And she heard the sound of his footsteps approaching. She again supplicated him to allow her 5 minutes longer to finish her prayers, which he, knowing she was completely within his power, granted her, and again left her. Fatima again renewed her inquiries to her sister. "Do you see anyone coming yet?" Her sister replied, "There is not a human being within sight." When the 5 minutes had elapsed, the voice of Bluebeard was heard bawling out, "Are you ready yet?" She again beseeched him to allow her only 2 minutes more, and then addressed her sister. "Dear Anne, do you see anyone coming yet?" "I see," said her sister, "a cloud of dust rising a little to the left." In breathless agitation she cried, "Do you think it is my brothers?" "Alas, no, my dearest Fatima," returned her sister. "It is only a flock of sheep." Again the voice of Bluebeard was heard, and she begged for 1 minute longer. Then she called out for one last time, "Sister Anne, do you see no one coming yet?" Her sister quickly answered, "I see 2 men on horseback, but they are still a great way off." "Thank heaven!" exclaimed Fatima. "I shall yet be saved, for it must be my 2 brothers. My dearest sister, make every signal in your power to hasten them forward, or they will be too late." Bluebeard's patience being now exhausted, he burst open the door in a rage, and made a blow at the wretched Fatima, with the intention of striking off her head, but she sprang close to him and evaded it. Furious at being foiled in his aim, he threw her from him, and then seizing her by the hair of the head, was in the act of striking her a blow with his scimitar, when the noise of persons approaching with hasty steps arrested the project of his sanguinary arm. Bluebeard had not time to conjecture who the intruders might be, when the door opened, and 2 officers, with their swords drawn, rushed into the apartment. Struck with terror, the guilty wretch released his wife from his grasp, and without attempting to resist, he tried to effect his escape from the resentment of her brothers, but they pursued and seized him before he had gotten above 20 paces from the place. After reproaching Bluebeard with his cruelty, they dragged him back to the spot where he intended to have murdered their sister, and there, stabbing him to the heart with their swords, he expired, uttering the most horrid oaths and execrations. Fatima, who had fallen to the ground at the time Bluebeard quitted his hold of her, still lay in the same situation unsensible, for the appearance of her brothers, at the moment she expected certain death, had thrown her into a faint, which continued during the whole time they were engaged in dispatching her husband. The 2 young officers now turned their attention to their sister, whom they raised from the ground, but she could hardly be persuaded of her safety, till they pointed to where Bluebeard lay extended and lifeless. Fatima, on recovering a little, tenderly embraced her deliverers, and the appearance of their sister Anne, who had come down from the top of the battlements, added to their happiness, as all those horrid murders which had been committed by Bluebeard were unknown to his domestics, on whose credulity he imposed by falsehoods, which they had no means of detecting. Fatima and her brothers thought the most prudent way to act was to assemble them together, and then disclose the wickedness of their late master. By the direction of Fatima, her 2 brothers conducted all the servants to the dreadful scene of her husband's cruelties, and then showing them his dead body, related the whole occurrences which had taken place. They all said that his punishment was not adequate to what he deserved, and begged that they might be continued to the service of their mistress. As Bluebeard had no relations, Fatima was sole heir to the whole of his immense property, and mistress of the castle, in the possession of which she confirmed by the laws of the country. She then sent notice to all the families in the neighborhood of the death of her husband, and the horrid proofs of his cruelty were laid open for 2 days to all who chose to inspect them. He was then buried privately, along with all the bodies of the ladies he had murdered, and the fatal closet underwent complete repair, which removed every trace of his barbarity. Soon after this, Fatima gave a magnificent entertainment to all her friends, where happiness was seen in every face, and on this occasion the poor, who were assembled for many miles round, partook most liberally of her bounty. Though possessed of riches most inexhaustible, Fatima disposed of them with so much discretion that she gained the esteem of everyone who knew her. She bestowed handsome fortunes on her 2 brothers, and to her sister, who was married about 2 months after, she gave a very large dowry. The beauty, riches, and amiable conduct of Fatima attracted a number of admirers, and among others a young nobleman of very high rank, who, to a handsome person, added every quality calculated to make a good husband, and after a reasonable time spent in courtship, their marriage was celebrated with great rejoicings.
The excursion steamer brought us from Constantinople to the shore of the island of Principe, and we disembarked. The number of passengers was not large. There was one Polish family, a father, a mother, a daughter, and her bridegroom, and then we 2. Oh yes, I must not forget that we were already on the wooden bridge which crosses the Golden Horn to Constantinople. A Greek, a rather youthful man, joined us. He was probably an artist, judging by the portfolio he carried under his arm. Long black locks floated to his shoulders, his face was pale, and his black eyes were deeply set in their sockets. From the first moment he interested me, especially for his obligingness and for his knowledge of local conditions. But he talked too much, and then I turned away from him. All the more agreeable was the Polish family. The father and mother were good-natured, fine people, the lover a handsome young fellow of direct and refined manners. They had come to Principe to spend the summer months for the sake of the daughter, who was slightly ailing. The beautiful pale girl was either just recovering from a severe illness or else a serious disease was just fastening its hold upon her. She leaned upon her lover when she walked, and very often sat down to rest, while the frequent dry little cough interrupted her whispers. Whenever she coughed, her escort would considerately pause in their walk. He always cast upon her a glance of sympathetic suffering, and she would look back at him as if she would say, "It is nothing, I am happy." They believed in health and happiness. On the recommendation of the Greek, who departed from us immediately at the pier, the family secured quarters in the hotel on the hill. The hotel keeper was a Frenchman, and his entire building was equipped comfortably and artistically according to the French style. We breakfasted together, and when the noon heat had abated somewhat, we all betook ourselves to the heights, where in the grove of Siberian stone pines we could refresh ourselves with the view. Hardly had we found a suitable spot and settled ourselves when the Greek appeared again. He greeted us slightly and looked about, and he seated himself only a few steps from us. He opened his portfolio and began to sketch. "I think he purposely sits with his back to the rocks so that we can't look at his sketch," I said. "We don't have to," said the young Pole. "We have enough before us to look at." After a while he added, "It seems to me he's sketching us in as a sort of background." "Well, let him." We truly did have enough to gaze at. There is not a more beautiful or happy corner of the world than that very Principe. The political martyr, Irene, contemporary of Charles the Great, lived there for a month as an exile. If I could live a month of my life there, I would be happy for the memory of it for the rest of my days. I shall never forget even that one day spent at Principe. The air was as clear as a diamond, so soft, so caressing, that one's whole soul swung out upon it into the distance. At the right beyond the sea projected the brown Asiatic summits. To the left in the distance purpled the steep coasts of Europe. The neighboring Chaki, one of the 9 islands of the Prince's archipelago, rose with its cypress forests into the peaceful heights like a sorrowful dream, crowned by a great structure, an asylum for those whose minds are sick. The sea of Marmora was but slightly ruffled and played in all the colors like a sparkling opal. In the distance the sea was as white as milk, then rosy, between the two islands a glowing orange, and below us it was beautifully greenish blue, like a transparent sapphire. It was resplendent in its own beauty. Nowhere were there any large ships. Only two small craft flying the English flag sped along the shore. One was a steamboat as big as a watchman's booth. The second had about 12 oarsmen, and when their oars rose simultaneously, molten silver dripped from them. Trustful dolphins darted in and out among them and dove with long arching flights above the surface of the water. Through the blue heavens now and then calm eagles winged their way, measuring the space between two continents. The entire slope below us was covered with blossoming roses whose fragrance filled the air. From the coffee house near the sea, music was carried up to us through the clear air, hushed somewhat by the distance. The effect was enchanting. We all sat silent and steeped our souls completely in the picture of paradise. The young Polish girl lay on the grass with her head supported on the bosom of her lover. The pale oval of her delicate face was slightly tinged with soft color, and from her blue eyes tears suddenly gushed forth. The lover understood, bent down, and kissed tear after tear. Her mother was also moved to tears, and I, even I, felt a strange twinge. "Here mind and body must both get well," whispered the girl. "How happy a land this is." "God knows I haven't any enemies, but if I had I would forgive them here," said the father in a trembling voice. And again we became silent. We were all in such a wonderful mood. So unspeakably sweet it all was. Each felt for himself a whole world of happiness, and each one would have shared his happiness with the whole world. All felt the same, and so no one disturbed another. We had scarcely even noticed the Greek after an hour or so had risen, folded his portfolio, and with a slight nod had taken his departure. We remained. Finally, after several hours, when the distance was becoming overspread with a darker violet, so magically beautiful in the south, the mother reminded us it was time to depart. We arose and walked down towards the hotel with the easy, elastic steps that characterize carefree children. We sat down in the hotel under the handsome veranda. Hardly had we been seated when we heard below the sounds of quarreling and oaths. Our Greek was wrangling the hotel keeper, and for the entertainment of it we listened. The amusement did not last long. "If I didn't have other guests," growled the hotel keeper, and ascended the steps towards us. "I beg you to tell me, sir," asked the young Pole of the approaching hotel keeper. "Who is that gentleman? What's his name?" Who knows what the fellow's name is," grumbled the hotel keeper, and he gazed venomously downwards. "We call him the vampire." "An artist?" "Fine trade. He sketches only corpses. Just as soon as someone in Constantinople or here in the neighborhood dies, that very day he has a picture of the dead one completed. That fellow paints them beforehand, and he never makes a mistake, just like a vulture." The old Polish woman shrieked affrightedly. In her arms lay her daughter, pale as chalk. She had fainted. In one bound the lover had leaped down the steps. With one hand he seized the Greek, and with the other reached for the portfolio. We ran down after him. Both men were rolling in the sand. The contents of the portfolio were scattered all about. On one sheet, sketched with a crayon, was the head of the young Polish girl, her eyes closed and a wreath of myrtle on her brow. To be too impressionable is as much a source of weakness as to be hypersensitive. So many messages come flooding in upon one another that confusion is the result. The mind chokes, imagination grows congested. Jones, as an imaginative writing man, was well aware of this, yet could not always prevent it, for if he dulled his mind to one impression, he ran the risk of blunting it to all. To guard his main idea, and picketed safe conduct through the sea of editions that instantly flocked to join it, was a psychological puzzle that sometimes overtaxed his powers of critical selection. He prepared for it, however. An editor would ask him for a story, about 5,000 words, you know, and Jones would answer, "I'll send it to you with pleasure, when it comes. He knew his difficulty too well to promise more. Ideas were never lacking, but their length of treatment belonged to the machinery he could not coerce. They were alive. They refused to come to heel to suit mere editors. Midway in a tale that started crystal clear and definite in its original germ, would pour a flood of new impressions that either smothered the first conception or developed it beyond recognition. Often a short story exfoliated in this bursting way beyond his power to stop it. He began one, never knowing where it would lead him. It was ever an adventure. Like Jack the Giant Killer's beanstalk, it grew secretly in the night, fed by everything he read, saw, felt, or heard. Jones was too impressionable. He received too many impressions and too easily. For this reason, when working at a definite, short idea, he preferred an empty room without pictures, furniture, books, or anything suggestive, and with a skylight that shut out scenery, just ink, blank paper, and the clear picture in his mind. His own interior, unstimulated by the geysers of external life, he made some pretense of regulating, though even under these favorable conditions the matter was not too easy. So prolifically does the sensitive mind engender. His experience in the empty room of the carpenter's house was a curious case in point. In the little Ura village where his cousin lived to educate his children. "We're all on a pension above the post office here," the cousin wrote, "but just now the house is full, and besides is rather noisy. I've taken an attic room for you at the carpenter's near the forest. Some things of mine have been stored there all winter, but I moved the cases out this morning. There's a bed, writing table, wash hand stand, sofa, and a skylight window. Otherwise empty, as I know you prefer it. You can have your meals with us." And this just suited Jones, who had 6 weeks' work on hand for which he needed empty solitude. His idea was slight and very tender. Accretions would easily smother clear presentment. Its treatment must be delicate, simple, unconfused. The room, really, was an attic, but large, wide, high. He heard the wind rush past the skylight when he went to bed. When the cupboard was open, he heard the wind there too, washing the outer walls and tiles. From his pillow he saw a patch of stars peep down upon him. Jones knew the mountains and the woods were close, but he could not see them. Better still, he could not smell them. And he went to bed dead tired, full of his theme for work next morning. He saw it to the end. He could almost have promised 5,000 words. With the dawn he would be up and at it, for he usually woke very early. His mind surcharged, as though subconscious had matured the material in sleep. Cold bath, cup of tea, and then his writing table. And the quicker he could reach the writing table, the richer was the content of imaginative thought. What had puzzled him the night before was invariably cleared up in the morning. Only illness could interfere with the process and routine of it. But this time it was otherwise. He woke and instantly realized, with a shock of surprise and disappointment, that his mind was groping. It was groping for his little lost idea. There was nothing physically wrong with him. He felt rested, fresh, clear-headed. But his brain was searching, moreover, in a crowd, trying to seize hold of the train it had relinquished several hours ago. It caught at an evasive, empty shell. The idea had utterly changed, or rather it seemed smothered by a host of new impressions that came pouring in upon it. New modes of treatment, points of view, and fact development. In the light of these extensions and novel aspects, his original idea had altered beyond recognition. The germ had marvelously exfoliated, so that a whole volume could alone express it. An army of fresh suggestions clamored for expression. His subconsciousness had grown thick with life. It surged, active, crowded, tumultuous, and the darkness puzzled him. He remembered the absence of accustomed windows, but it was only when the candlelight brought close the face of his watch, with 2 o'clock upon it, that he heard the sound of confused whispering in the corners of the room, and realized with a little twinge of fear that those who whispered had just been standing beside his very bed. The room was full, though the candlelight proclaimed it empty. Bare walls, bare floor, 5 pieces of unimaginative furniture, and 50 stars peeping through the skylight. It was undeniably thronged with living people whose minds had called him out of a heavy sleep. The whispers, of course, died off into the wind that swept through roof and skylight, but the whisperers remained. They had been trying to get at him. Waking suddenly, he caught them at the very act, and all had brought new interpretations with them. His thought had fundamentally altered. The original idea was snowed under. New images brimmed in his mind, and his brain was working as it worked under the high pressure of creative moments. Jones sat up, trembling a little, and stared about him into the empty room that yet was densely packed with these invisible whisperers, and he realized this astonishing thing, that he was the object of their deliberate assault, and that scores of other minds, deep, powerful, very active minds, were thundering and beating upon the doors of his imagination. The onset of them was terrific and bewildering, the attack of aggressive ideas obliterating his original story beneath a flood of new suggestions. Inspiration had become suddenly torrential, yet so vast as to be unwieldy, incoherent, useless. It was like the tempest of images that fever brings. His first conception seemed no longer delicate, but petty. It had turned unreal and tiny compared with this enormous choice of treatment, extension, development that now overwhelmed his throbbing brain. Fear caught vividly at him, and he searched the empty attic room in vain for explanation. There was absolutely nothing to produce this tempest of new impressions. People seemed talking to him all together, jumbled somewhat, but insistently. It was obsession rather than inspiration, and so bitingly, dreadfully real. "Who are you all?" his mind whispered to blank walls and vacant quarters. Back from the shouting floor and ceiling came the chorus of images that stormed and clamored for expression. Jones lay and listened. He let them come. There was nothing else to do. He lay, fearful, negative, receptive. It was all too big for him to manage, set to some scale of high achievement that submerged his own small powers. It came, too, in a series of impressions, all separate, yet all somehow interwoven. In vain he tried to sort them out and sift them, as well as sort out waves upon an agitated sea. They were too self-assertive for direction or control. Like wild animals, hungry, thirsty, ravening, they rushed from every side and fastened on his mind. Yet he perceived them in a certain sequence. For, first, the unfurnished attic chamber was full of human passion, of love and hate, revenge and wicked cunning, of jealousy, courage, cowardice, of every vital human emotion ever longed for, enjoyed, or frustrated, all clamoring for expression. Flaming across and through these, incongruously threaded in and out, ran next a yearning softness of incredible beauty that sighed in the empty spaces of his heart, pleading for impossible fulfillment. And, after these, carrying both one and other upon their surface, huge questions flashed and dived and thundered in a pattern, wild entanglement, calling to be unraveled and made straight. Moreover, with every set came a new suggested treatment of the little clear idea he had taken to bed with him 5 hours before. Jones adopted each in turn. Imagination writhed and twisted beneath the stress of all these potential modes of expression he must choose between. His small idea exfoliated into many volumes, work enough to fill a dozen lives. It was most gorgeously exhilarating, though so hopelessly unmanageable. He felt like many minds in one. Then came another chain of impressions, violent, yet steady, owing to their depth. The voices, questions, pleadings turned into pictures, and he saw, struggling through the deeps of him, enormous quantities of people passing along like rivers, massed, herded, swayed, here and there, by some outstanding figure of command who directed them like flowing water. They shrieked and fought and battled, then sank out of sight, huddled and destroyed, in blood, and their places were taken instantly by white crowds with shining eyes and yearning in their faces, who climbed precipitous heights towards some radiance that kept ever out of sight. like sunrise behind mountains that clouds then swallow. The pelt and thunder of images was destructive in its torrent. His little first idea was drowned and wrecked. Jones sank back, exhausted, utterly dismayed. He gave up all attempt to make a selection. The driving storm swept through him, on, now waxing, now waning, but never growing less, and apparently endless as the sky. It rushed in circles like the turning of a giant wheel. All the activities that human minds have ever battled with since thought began came booming, crashing, straining for expression against the imaginative stuff whereof his mind was built. The walls began to yield and settle. It was like the chaos that madness brings. He did not struggle against it. He let it come, lying open and receptive, pliant and plastic to every detail of the vast invasion. And the only time he attempted a complete obedience, reaching out for the pencil and notebook that lay beside his bed, he desisted instantly again, sinking back upon his pillows with a kind of frightened laughter, for the tempest seemed then to knock him down and bruise his very brain. Inextricable confusion caught him. He might as well have tried to make notes of the entire Alexandrian library in half an hour. Then, most singular of all, as he felt the sleep of exhaustion fall upon his tired nerves, he heard that deep, prodigious sound. All that had preceded it gathered marvelously in, mothering it with a sweetness that seemed to his imagination like some harmonious, geometrical skein, including all of the activities men's minds have ever known. Faintly he realized it only, discerned from infinitely far away. Into the streams of apparent contradiction that warred so strenuously about him, it seemed to bring some hint of unifying, harmonious explanation, and here and there, as sleep buried him, he imagined that chords lay threaded along strings of cadences, breaking sometimes even into melody, music that rose everywhere from life and wove thought into a homogeneous whole. "Sleep well?" his cousin inquired, when he appeared very late the next day for dinner. "Think you'll be able to work in that room all right?" "I slept, yes, thanks," said Jones. "No doubt I shall work there right enough when I'm rested. By the by," he asked presently, "what has the attic been used for lately? What's been in it, I mean?" "Books, only books," was the reply. "I've stored my library there for months, without a chance of using it. I move about so much, you see. 500 books were taken out just before you came. I often think," he added lightly, "that when books are unopened like that for long, the minds that wrote them must get restless and—" "What sort of books were they?" Jones interrupted. "Fiction, poetry, philosophy, history, religion, music. I've got 200 books on music alone." My cousins, Kate and Tom Howard, married at Trinity at Easter time, concluded to commence housekeeping by taking one of those delightfully expensively furnished, unfurnished cottages with which the fashionable watering place of W abounds, from whose rear windows one might almost take a plunge into the surf, the beach beginning at the back door. They went down quite early in May, being in a great hurry to try their domestic experiment, and as the evenings were still cold, they spent them about the open fire, spooning. It was upon one of those nights, about 11 o'clock, that they were startled by a noise, as of some small object falling, soon followed by the sound of heavy footsteps, and then quiet again reigned supreme. At once Tom, poker in hand, boldly started in search of the burglar, followed by Kate, wildly clutching at his coat tail, and in a state of tremor, they looked upstairs under the various beds, Kate suggesting that in novels they were always to be found there. The dining room was next explored, where all seemed well, and lastly, the kitchen, where they found what was evidently a solution to the mystery. The burglar had entered by the back door, which was found to be unlocked and slightly ajar. The first excitement subsiding, they returned again to the dining room, where Tom, upon closer inspection, then discovered that one of a pair of quaint little pepper pots, wedding gifts, was missing, and other small articles on the sideboard had been slightly disturbed. The next morning, when Kate mildly remonstrated with the queen of the kitchen for her carelessness, she received a shock by being told that it was her usual custom to leave the door open, so that it would be easy, convenient like for the milkmaid. They parted with her, and a new maid was engaged, whose chief qualification for the place was that she was the most faithful in the discharge of her duties, especially in locking up. While they mourned the loss of the pepper pot, still it seemed so trifling when they thought of that lovely repousse salad bowl sent by Aunt Julia, which stood nearby, that nothing was said of the loss outside of the family, and the little household settled into its normal state once more of billing and cooling. About a fortnight later, Tom started out one night with an old fisherman, one of the natives, and a local character to indulge in that delightful pastime so dear to the heart of man, known as eeling. And as the night was dark, the eels were particularly sporty, so that it was well on towards the wee small hours when Tom at last returned to the cottage. He found all excitement within. Kate was in hysterics, and the new maid, also weeping, was industriously applying the camphor bottle to her mistress's nose. The burglar, or ghost, as they had now decided, the windows and doors being found to be securely locked this time, had been abroad again, but had succeeded in purloining nothing. His royal ghostship had amused himself, apparently, by simply walking about. "Oh, Tom, he had on such heavy boots and was so dreadfully bold about it," said Kate tearfully. From that time, Kate became nervous and refused to be left alone. Tom started whenever a door creaked, and the treasurer departed hurriedly, saying, "Faith, the house is haunted, sure." After that, Kate spent her days in girl hunting, and her nights in answering shadowy advertisements that never materialized. They tried Irish, English, Dutch, and a heathen Chinese, with a sprinkling of colored ladies to vary the monotony. They seemed about to become famous throughout the length and breadth of the land as the family that changed help once a week when they landed on treasure number 2. Shortly after her advent, we were all asked down to W to help celebrate their happiness, and incidentally to christen the new dinner set. We were not a little surprised at finding Kate so pale and Tom rather distrait. However, after a delightful dinner that should have filled with pleasure the most exacting bride, we adjourned to the piazza, leaving the men to the contemplation of their cigars. We were enthusiastic in our praise of the house and congratulated Kate in securing such a prize, when, to our horror, she burst into tears and said, "Oh, girls, it's a dreadful place. It's haunted," and then tearfully proceeded with the details until we all felt creepy and suggested the parlor and lights. It was not until long afterwards that Kate discovered that Tom had also related the ghost story to the men. That evening, to which Ned Harris had said, laconically, "Rats," and Bob Shaw laughingly remarked, "Tom, old chap, you really shouldn't take your nightcap so strong." About the 1st of July, the climax came. The ghost walked again, this time taking not only the remaining pepper pot, but also a silver salt cellar. Evidently, he had a penchant for small articles, but unlike former times, everything on the sideboard was in the greatest disorder. Aunt Julia's salad bowl was found on the floor, and not far away, the cheese dish, with its contents scattered about. This time one of the windows was found half open. A week later, a note came to me from Kate saying that she and Tom had gone to Saratoga to spend the remainder of the season with her mother. The following spring, Tom received a note and a parcel from Mr. B., the owner of the house at W., which read as follows: "Dear Mr. Howard, I sent you by express 3 articles of silver, which my wife suggests may belong to you, as they are marked with your initials, namely 2 silver pepper pots and a salt cellar. They were found the other day, during the process of spring house cleaning, in a rat hole behind the sideboard. I forgot to have the hole stopped up last spring, or to caution you against the water rats. The great fellows will get in, you know. Kind regards to Mrs. Howard. Very truly, John B." The next season of the Ghost Club was organized, the badge being a small silver rat bearing proudly aloft a tiny pepper pot. We thoughtfully offered Tom the presidency, but he declined, with offended dignity, from the effects of which I think he will never fully recover. I have always noticed a prevalent want of courage, even among persons of superior intelligence and culture, as to imparting their own psychological experiences when those have been of a strange sort. Almost all men are afraid that what they could relate in such wise would find no parallel or response in a listener's internal life, and might be suspected or laughed at. A truthful traveler, who should have seen some extraordinary creature in the likeness of a sea serpent, would have no fear of mentioning it, but the same traveler, having had some singular presentiment, impulse, vagary of thought, vision, so-called, dream, or other remarkable mental impression, would hesitate considerably before he would own to it. To this reticence I attribute much of the obscurity in which such subjects are involved. We do not habitually communicate our experiences of these subjective things, as we do our experiences of objective creation. The consequence is that the general stock of experience in this regard appears exceptional, and really is so, in respect of being miserably imperfect. In what I am going to relate, I have no intention of setting up, opposing, or supporting any theory whatever. I know the history of the bookseller of Berlin. I have studied the case of the wife of the late Astronomer Royal, as related by Sir David Brewster, and I have followed the minutest details of a much more remarkable case of spectral illusion occurring within my private circle of friends. It may be necessary to state as to this last that the sufferer, a lady, was in no degree, however distant, related to me. A mistaken assumption on that head might suggest an explanation of a part of my own case, but only a part, which would be wholly without foundation. It cannot be referred to my inheritance of any developed peculiarity, nor had I ever before in any at all similar experience, nor have I ever had any at all similar experience since. It does not signify how many years ago, or how few, a certain murder was committed in England, which attracted great attention. We hear more than enough of murderers as they rise in succession to their atrocious eminence, and I would bury the memory of this particular brute, if I could, as his body was buried, in Newgate Jail. I purposely abstained from giving any direct clue to the criminal's individuality. When the murder was first discovered, no suspicion fell, or I ought to rather say, for I cannot be too precise in my facts, it was nowhere publicly hinted that any suspicion fell on the man who was afterwards brought to trial. As no reference was at that time made to him in the newspapers, it is obviously impossible that any description of him can at that time have been given to the newspapers. It is essential that this fact be remembered. Unfolding at breakfast my morning paper, containing the account of that first discovery, I found it to be deeply interesting, and I read it with close attention. I read it twice, if not 3 times. The discovery had been made in a bedroom, and, when I laid down the paper, I was aware of a flash, rush, flow, I do not know what to call it. No word I can find is satisfactorily descriptive, in which I seemed to see that bedroom passing through my room, like a picture impossibly painted on a running river. Though almost instantaneous in its passing, it was perfectly clear, so clear that I distinctly, and with a sense of relief, observed the absence of the dead body from the bed. It was in no romantic place that I had this curious sensation, but in the chambers in Piccadilly, very near to the corner of St. James Street. It was entirely new to me. I was in my easy chair at the moment, and the sensation was accompanied with a peculiar shiver which started the chair from its position. But it is to be noted that the chair ran easily on casters. I went to one of the windows, there are 2 in the room, and the room is on the 2nd floor, to refresh my eyes with the moving objects down in Piccadilly. It was a bright autumn morning, and the street was sparkling and cheerful. The wind was high, As I looked out, it brought down from the park a quantity of falling leaves, which the gust took and whirled into a spiral pillar. As the pillar fell and the leaves dispersed, I saw two men on the opposite side of the way, going from west to east. They were one behind the other. The foremost man often looked back over his shoulder. The second man followed him, at a distance of some 30 paces, with his right hand menacingly raised. First, the singularity and steadiness of this threatening gesture in so public a thoroughfare attracted my attention, and next, the more remarkable circumstance that nobody heeded it. Both men threaded their way among the other passengers, with a smoothness hardly consistent even with the action of walking on pavement, and no single creature that I could see gave them place, touched them, or looked after them. In passing before my windows, they both stared up at me. I saw their two faces very distinctly, and I knew that I could recognize them anywhere. Not that I had consciously noticed anything very remarkable in either face, except that the man who went first had an unusually lowering appearance, and that the face of the man who followed him was of a color of impure wax. I am a bachelor, and my valet and his wife constitute my whole establishment. My occupation is in a certain branch bank, and I wish that my duties as head of a department were as light as they are popularly supposed to be. They kept me in town that autumn, when I stood in need of a change. I was not ill, but I was not well. My reader is to make the most that can be reasonably made of my feeling jaded, having a depressing sense upon me of a monotonous life, and being slightly dyspeptic. I am assured by my renowned doctor that my real state of health at the time justifies no stronger description, and I quote his own from his written answer to my request for it. As the circumstances of the murder, gradually unraveling, took stronger and stronger possession of the public mind, I kept them away from mine, by knowing as little about them as was possible in the midst of the universal excitement, but I knew that a verdict of willful murder had been found against the suspected murderer, and that he had been committed to Newgate for trial. I also knew that his trial had been postponed over one sessions of the Central Criminal Court, on the ground of general prejudice and want of time for the preparation of the defense. I may further have known, but I believe I did not, when, or about when, the sessions to which his trial stood postponed would come. My sitting room, bedroom, and dressing room are all on one floor. With the last, there is no communication but through the bedroom. True, there is a door in it, once communicating with the staircase, but a part of the fitting of my bath has been, and had then been for some years, fixed across it. At the same period, and as a part of the same arrangement, the door had been nailed up and canvassed over. I was standing in my bedroom late one night, giving some directions to my servant before he went to bed. My face was towards the only available door of communication with the dressing room, and it was closed. My servant's back was towards that door. While I was speaking to him, I saw it open, and a man look in, who very earnestly and mysteriously beckoned to me. That man was the man who had gone second of the two along Piccadilly, and whose face was the color of impure wax. The figure, having beckoned, drew back and closed the door, with no longer pause than was made by my crossing the bedroom. I opened the dressing room door and looked in. I had a lighted candle ready in my hand. I felt no inward expectation of seeing the figure in the dressing room, and I did not see it there. Conscious that my servant stood amazed, I turned round to him and said, "Derek, could you believe that in my cool senses I fancied I saw it?" As I there laid my hand upon his breast, with a sudden start he trembled violently and said, "Oh Lord, yes, a dead man beckoning." Now, I do not believe that this John Derek, my trusty and attached servant for more than 20 years, had any impression whatever of having seen any such figure until I touched him. The change in him was so startling when I touched him that I fully believed he derived his impression in some occult manner from me at that instant. I bade John Derek to bring some brandy, and I gave him a dram, and was glad to take one myself. Of what had preceded the night's phenomenon, I told him not a single word. Reflecting on it, I was absolutely certain that I had never seen that face before, except on one occasion in Piccadilly. Comparing its expression when beckoning at the door with its expression when it had stared up at me as I stood at my window, I came to the conclusion that on the first occasion it had sought to fasten itself upon my memory, and that on the second occasion it had made sure of being immediately remembered. I was not very comfortable that night, though I felt a certainty, difficult to explain, that the figure would not return. At daylight, I fell into a heavy sleep, from which I was awakened by John Derrick's coming to my bedside with a paper in his hand. This paper, it appeared, had been the subject of an altercation at the door between its bearer and my servant. It was a summons to me to serve upon a jury at the forthcoming sessions of the Central Criminal Court at the Old Bailey. I had never before been summoned on a jury, as John Derrick well knew. He believed, I am not certain at this hour whether with reason or otherwise, that class of jurors were customarily chosen on a lower qualification than mine, and he had at first refused to accept the summons. The man who served it had taken the matter very coolly. He had said that my attendance or non-attendance was nothing to him. There the summons was, and I should deal with it at my own peril, and not at his. For a day or two I was undecided whether to respond to this call, or take no notice of it. I was not conscious of the slightest mysterious bias, influence, or attraction, one way or other. Of that I am as strictly sure as every other statement I have made here. Ultimately, I decided, as a break in the monotony of my life, that I would go. The appointed morning was a raw morning in the month of November. There was a dense brown fog in Piccadilly, and it became positively black in the last degree oppressive east of Temple Bar. I found the passages and staircases of the courthouse flaringly lighted with gas, and the court itself similarly illuminated. I think that until I was conducted by officers into the old court and saw its crowded state, I did not know that the murderer was to be tried that day. I think that until I was so helped into the old court with considerable difficulty, I did not know into which of the two courts sitting my summons would take me, but this must not be received as positive assertion, for I am not completely satisfied in my mind on either point. I took my seat in the place appropriated to jurors in waiting, and I looked about the court as well as I could through the cloud of fog and breath that was heavy in it. I noticed the black vapor hanging like a murky curtain outside the great windows, and I noticed the stifled sound of wheels on the straw or tan that was littered in the street. Also, the hum of the people gathered there, which a shrill whistle, or a louder song or hail than the rest, occasionally pierced. Soon afterward, the judges, 2 in number, entered and took their seats. The buzz in the court was awfully hushed. The direction was given to put the murderer to the bar. He appeared there, and in that same instant I recognized him, the first of the 2 men who had gone down Piccadilly. If my name had been called then, I doubt if I could have answered to it audibly, but it was called about 6th or 8th in the panel, and I was by that time able to say, "Here." Now observe, as I stepped into the box, the prisoner, who had been looking on attentively but with no sign of concern, became violently agitated and beckoned to his attorney. The prisoner's wish to challenge me was so manifest that it occasioned a pause, during which the attorney, with his hand upon the dock, whispered with his client and shook his head. I afterwards had it from that gentleman that the prisoner's first affrighted words to him were, "At all hazards challenge that man," but that as he would give no reason for it, and admitted that he had not even known my name until he heard it called, and I appeared, it was not done. Both on the ground already explained, that I wished to avoid reviving the unwholesome memory of that murderer, and also because a detailed account of his long trial is by no means indispensable to my narrative, I shall confine myself closely to such incidents in the 10 days and nights during which we, the jury, were kept together, as directly bear on my own curious personal experience. It is in that, and not in the murderer, that I seek to interest my reader. It is to that, and not to a page of the Newgate calendar, that I beg attention. I was chosen foreman of the jury. On the second morning of the trial, after evidence had been taken for 2 hours, I heard the church clock strike. Happening to cast my eyes over my brother jurymen, I found an inexplicable difficulty in counting them. I counted them several times, yet always with the same difficulty. In short, I made them one too many. I touched the brother juryman whose place was next to me, and I whispered to him, "Oblige me by counting us." He looked surprised by the request, but turned his head and counted. "Why?" he said suddenly. "We are but that's not possible. We are 12. According to my counting that day, we were always right in detail, but in the gross, we were always one too many. There was no appearance, no figure, to account for it, but I had now an inward foreshadowing of the figure that was surely coming. The jury were housed at the London Tavern. We all slept in one large room on separate tables, and we were constantly in the charge and under the eye of the officer sworn to hold us in safekeeping. I see no reason for suppressing the real name of that officer. He was intelligent, highly polite, and obliging, and, I was glad to hear, much respected in the city. He had an agreeable presence, good eyes, enviable black whiskers, and a fine sonorous voice. His name was Mr. Harker. When we turned into our 12 beds at night, Mr. Harker's bed was drawn across the door. On the night of the second day, not being disposed to lie down, and seeing Mr. Harker sitting on his bed, I went and sat beside him, and offered him a pinch of snuff. As Mr. Harker's hand touched mine in taking it from my box, a peculiar shiver crossed him, and he said, "Who is this?" Following Mr. Harker's eyes and looking along the room, I saw again the figure I expected, the second of the two men who had gone down Piccadilly. I rose and advanced a few steps, then stopped, and looked round at Mr. Harker. He was quite unconcerned, laughed, and said in a pleasant way, "I thought for a moment we had a 13th juryman without a bed, but I see it is the moonlight." Making no revelation to Mr. Harker, but inviting him to take a walk with me to the end of the room, I watched what the figure did. It stood for a few moments by the bedside of each of my 11 brother jurymen, close to the pillow. It always went to the right-hand side of the bed, and always passed out crossing the foot of the next bed. It seemed from the action of the head merely to look down pensively at each recumbent figure. It took no notice of me, or of my bed, which was that nearest to Mr. Harker's. It seemed to go out where the moonlight came in, through a high window, as by an aerial flight of stairs. Next morning at breakfast, it appeared that everybody present had dreamed of the murdered man last night, except myself and Mr. Harker. I now felt as convinced that the second man who had gone down Piccadilly was the murdered man, so to speak, as if it had been borne into my comprehension by his immediate testimony. But even this took place, and in a manner for which I was not at all prepared. On the 5th day of the trial, when the case for the prosecution was drawing to a close, a miniature of the murdered man, missing from his bedroom upon the discovery of the deed, and afterwards found in a hiding place where the murderer had been seen digging, was put into evidence. Having been identified by the witness under examination, it was handed up to the bench, and thence handed down to be inspected by the jury. As an officer in a black gown was making his way with it across to me, the figure of the second man who had gone down Piccadilly impetuously started from the crowd, caught the miniature from the officer, and gave it to me with its own hands, at the same time saying in a low and hollow tone, before I saw the miniature, which was in a locket, I was younger then, and my face was not then drained of blood. It also came between me and the brother juryman to whom I would have given the miniature, and between him and the brother juryman to whom he would have given it, and so passed it on through the whole of our number, and back into my possession. Not one of them, however, detected this. At table, and generally when we were shut up together in Mr. Harker's custody, we had from the first naturally discussed the day's proceedings a good deal. On that 5th day, the case for the prosecution being closed, and we having that side of the question in a completed shape before us, our discussion was more animated and serious. Among our numbers was a vestryman, the densest idiot I have ever seen at large, who met the plainest evidence with the most preposterous objections. and who was sided with by two flabby parochial parasites, all the three impaneled from the district so delivered over to fever that they ought to have been upon their own trial for 500 murders. When these mischievous blockheads were at their loudest, which was towards midnight while some of us were already preparing for bed, I again saw the murdered man. He stood grimly behind them, beckoning to me. On my going towards them and striking into the conversation, he immediately retired. This was at the beginning of a separate series of appearances, confined to that long room in which we were confined. Whenever a knot of my brother jurymen laid their heads together, I saw the head of the murdered man among theirs. Whenever their comparison of notes was going against him, he would solemnly and irresistibly beckon to me. It will be borne in mind that down to the production of the miniature on the 5th day of the trial, I had never seen the appearance in court. 3 changes occurred now that we entered on the case for the defense. 2 of them I will mention together. First, the figure was now in court continually, and it never there addressed itself to me, but always to the person who was speaking at the time. For instance, the throat of the murdered man had been cut straight across, and the opening speech for the defense, it was suggested that the deceased might have cut his own throat. At that very moment, the figure with its throat in the dreadful condition referred to, this it had concealed before, stood at the speaker's elbow, motioning across and across its windpipe, now with the right hand, now with the left, vigorously suggesting to the speaker himself the impossibility of such a wound having been self-inflicted by either hand. For another instance, a witness to character, a woman, deposed to the prisoner's being the most amiable of mankind. The figure at that instant stood on the floor before her, looking her full in the face and pointing out the prisoner's evil countenance with an extended arm and an outstretched finger. The third change now to be added impressed me strongly, as the most marked and striking of all. I do not theorize upon it, I accurately state it and there leave it. Although the appearance was not itself perceived by those whom it addressed, its coming close to such persons was invariably attended by some trepidation or disturbance on their part. It seemed to me as if it were prevented by laws to which I was not amenable from fully revealing itself to others, and yet as if it could, invisibly, dumbly, and darkly, overshadow their minds. When the leading counsel for the defense suggested that hypothesis of suicide, and the figure stood at the learned gentleman's elbow, frightfully sawing at its severed throat, it is undeniable that the counsel faltered in his speech, lost for a few seconds the thread of his ingenious discourse, wiped his forehead with his handkerchief, and turned extremely pale. When the witness to character was confronted by the appearance, her eyes most certainly did follow the direction of its pointed finger, and rest in great hesitation and trouble upon the prisoner's face. 2 additional illustrations will suffice. On the 8th day of the trial, after the pause which was every day made early in the afternoon for a few minutes' rest and refreshment, I came back into the court with the rest of the jury, some little time before the return of the judges. Standing up in the box and looking about me, I thought the figure was not there, until, chancing to raise my eyes to the gallery, I saw it bending forward and leaning over a very decent woman, as if to assure itself whether the judges had resumed their seats or not. Immediately afterward, that woman screamed, fainted, and was carried out. So with the venerable, sagacious, and patient judge who conducted the trial. When the case was over, and he settled himself and his papers to sum up, the murdered man, entering by the judge's door, advanced to his lordship's desk and looked eagerly over his shoulder at the pages of his notes which he was turning. A change came over his lordship's face. His hand stopped. The peculiar shiver that I knew so well passed over him. He faltered, "Excuse me, gentlemen, for a few moments. I am somewhat oppressed by the vitiated air," and did not recover until he had drunk a glass of water. Through all the monotony of 6 of those interminable 10 days, the same judges and others on the bench, the same murderer in the dock, the same lawyers at the table, the same tones of question and answer rising to the roof of the court, the same scratching of the judge's pen, the same ushers going in and out, the same lights kindled at the same hour when there had been any natural light of day, the same foggy curtain outside the great windows when it was foggy, the same rain pattering and dripping when it was rainy, the same footmarks of turnkeys and prisoner day after day on the same sawdust, the same keys, locking and unlocking the same heavy doors. Through all the wearisome monotony which made me feel as if I had been foreman of the jury for a vast period of time, and Piccadilly had flourished covertly with Babylon, the murdered man never lost one trace of his distinctness in my eyes, nor was he at any moment less distinct than anybody else. I must not omit, as a matter of fact, that I never once saw the appearance which I call by the name of the murdered man look at the murderer. Again and again I wondered, why does he not? But he never did, nor did he look at me after the production of the miniature until the last closing minutes of the trial arrived. We retired to consider at 7 minutes before 10 at night. The idiotic vestryman and his 2 parochial parasites gave us so much trouble that we twice returned into the court to beg to have certain extracts from the judge notes read. 9 of us had not had the smallest doubt about those passages. Neither, I believe, had anyone in court. The dunder-headed triumvirate, however, having no idea of but obstruction, disputed them for that very reason. At length we prevailed, and finally the jury returned to court at 10 minutes past 12. The murdered man at that time stood directly opposite the jury box, on the other side of the court. As I took my place, his eyes rested on me. With great attention, he seemed satisfied, and slowly shook a great gray veil, which he carried on his arm for the first time, over his head and whole form. As I gave in our verdict guilty, the veil collapsed, all was gone, and his place was empty. The murderer, being asked by the judge, according to usage, whether he had anything to say before a sentence of death should be passed upon him, indistinctly muttered something which was described in the leading newspapers of the following day as a few rambling, incoherent, and half-audible words, in which he was understood to complain that he had not had a fair trial, because the foreman of the jury was prepossessed against him. The remarkable declaration that he really made was this: "My lord, I knew I was a doomed man when the foreman of my jury came into the box. My lord, I knew he would never let me off because, before I was taken, he somehow got into my bedside at the night, woke me, and put a rope around my neck." I took a large room far up Broadway, in a huge old building whose upper stories had been wholly unoccupied for years until I came. The place had long been given up to dust and cobwebs, to solitude and silence. I seemed groping among the tombs and invading the privacy of the dead. That first night I climbed up to my quarters. For the first time in my life a superstitious dread came over me, and as I turned a dark angle of the stairway and an invisible cobweb swung its lazy woof in my face and clung there, I shuddered as one who had encountered a phantom. I was glad enough when I reached my room and locked out the mold and the darkness. A cheery fire was burning in the grate, and I sat down before it with a comforting sense of relief. For 2 hours I sat there, thinking of bygone times, recalling old scenes, and summoning half-forgotten faces out of the mists of the past, listening in fancy to voices that long ago grew silent for a time, and to once familiar songs that nobody sings now. And as my reverie softened down to a sadder and sadder pathos, the shrieking of the winds outside softened to a wail. The angry beating of the rain against the panes diminished to a tranquil patter, and one by one the noises in the street subsided, until the hurrying footsteps of the last belated straggler died away in the distance and left no sound behind. The fire had burned low. A sense of loneliness crept over me. I arose and undressed, moving on tiptoe about the room, doing stealthily what I had to do, as if I were environed by sleeping enemies, whose slumbers it would be fatal to break. I covered up in bed and lay listening to the rain and wind and the faint creaking of distant shutters till they lulled me to sleep. I slept profoundly, but how long I do not know. All at once I found myself awake and filled with a shuddering expectancy. All was still, all but my own heart. I could hear it beat. Presently the bedclothes began to slip away slowly towards the foot of the bed, as if someone were pulling them. I could not stir, I could not speak. Still the blankets slipped deliberately away till my breast was uncovered. Then with great effort I seized them and drew them over my head. I waited, listened, waited. Once more that steady pull began, and once more I lay torpid, a century of dragging seconds till my breast was naked again. At last I roused my energies and snatched the covers back to their place and held them with a strong grip. I waited. By and by I felt a faint tug and took a fresh grip. The tug strengthened to a steady strain. It grew stronger and stronger. My hold parted, and for the third time the blanket slipped away. I groaned. An answering groan came from the foot of the bed. Beaded drops of sweat stood upon my forehead. I was more dead than alive. Presently I heard a heavy footstep in my room, the step of an elephant, it seemed to me. It was not like anything human, but it was moving from me. There was relief in that. I heard it approach the door, pass out without moving bolt or lock, and wander away among the dismal corridors, straining the floors and joists till they creaked again as it passed, and then silence reigned once more. When my excitement had calmed, I said to myself, "This is a dream, a simply hideous dream," and so I lay thinking it over until I convinced myself that it was a dream, and then a comforting laugh relaxed my lips and I was happy again. I got up and struck a light, and when I found that the locks and bolts were just as I had left them, another soothing laugh welled in my heart and rippled from my lips. I took my pipe and lit it, and was just sitting down before the fire when down went the pipe out of my nerveless fingers. The blood forsook my cheeks, and my placid breathing was cut short with a gasp. In the ashes on the hearth, side by side with my own bare footprint, was another, so vast that in comparison mine was but an infant's. Then I had had a visitor, and the elephant tread was explained. I put out the light and returned to bed, palsied with fear. I lay a long time, peering into the darkness and listening. Then I heard a grating noise overhead, like the dragging of a heavy body across the floor, then the throwing down of the body, and the shaking of my windows in response to the concussion. In distant parts of the building I heard the muffled slamming of the doors. I heard, at intervals, stealthy footsteps creeping in and out among the corridors, and up and down the stairs. Sometimes these noises approached my door, hesitated, and went away again. I heard the clanking of chains faintly in remote passages, and listened while the clanking grew nearer, while it wearily climbed the stairways, marking each move by the loose surplus of chain that fell with an accented rattle upon each succeeding step as the goblin that bore it advanced. I heard muttered sentences, half-uttered screams that seemed smothered violently, and the swish of invisible garments, the rush of invisible wings. Then I became conscious that my chamber was invaded, that I was not alone. I heard sighs and breathing about my bed, and mysterious whisperings. 3 little spheres of soft phosphorescent light appeared on the ceiling directly over my head, clung and glowed there a moment, and then dropped. 2 of them upon my face and 1 upon the pillow. They spattered liquidly and felt warm. Intuition told me they had turned to gouts of blood as they fell. I needed no light to satisfy myself of that. Then I saw pallid faces, dimly luminous, and white uplifted hands, floating bodiless in the air, floating a moment and then disappearing. The whispering ceased, and the voices and sounds, and a solemn stillness followed. I waited and listened. I felt I must have light or die. I was weak with fear. I slowly raised myself toward the sitting position, and my face came in contact with a clammy hand. All strength went from me apparently, and I fell back like a stricken invalid. Then I heard the rustle of a garment. It seemed to pass to the door and go out. When everything was still once more, I crept out of bed, sick and feeble, and lit the gas with a hand that trembled as if it were aged with 100 years. The light brought some little cheer to my spirits. I sat down and fell into a dreamy contemplation of that great footprint in the ashes. By and by, its outlines began to waver and grow dim. I glanced up, and the broad gas flame was slowly wilting away. In the same moment, I heard that elephantine tread again. I noted its approach nearer and nearer along the musty halls, and dimmer the light waned. The tread reached my very door and paused. The light had dwindled to a sickly blue, and all things about me lay in a spectral twilight. The door did not open, and yet I felt a faint gust of air fan my cheek, and presently it was conscious of a huge, cloudy presence before me. I watched it with fascinated eyes. A pale glow stole over the thing. Gradually, its cloudy folds took shape. An arm appeared, then legs, then a body, and last a great sad face looked out of the vapor. Stripped of its filmy housings, naked, muscular, and comely, the majestic Cardiff giant loomed above me. All my misery vanished, for a child might know that no harm could come with that benignant countenance. My cheerful spirits returned at once, and in sympathy with them the gas flamed up brightly again. Never a lonely outcast was so glad to welcome company as I was to greet the friendly giant. I said, "Why, is it nobody but you? Do you know, I have been scared to death for the last 2 or 3 hours. I am most honestly glad to see you. I wish I had a chair. Here, don't try to sit down in that thing." But it was too late. He was in it before I could stop him, and down he went. I never saw a chair shiver so in my life. Stop, you'll ruin Too late again. There was another crash, and another chair was resolved into its original elements. Confound it, haven't you got any judgment at all? Do you want to ruin all the furniture in the place? Here, you petrified fool. But it was no use. Before I could arrest him, he had sat down on the bed, and it was a melancholy ruin. Now what sort of a way is that to do? First you come lumbering about the place bringing a legion of vagabond goblins along with you to worry me to death, and then when I overlook an indelicacy of costume which would not be tolerated anywhere by cultivated people, except in a respectable theater, and not even there if the nudity were of your sex, you repay me by wrecking all the furniture you can find to sit down on. And why will you? You damage yourself as much as you do me. You have broken off the end of your spinal column, and littered up the floor with chips of your hams till the place looks like a marble yard. You ought to be ashamed of yourself. You are big enough to know better. Well, I will not break any more furniture, but what am I to do? I have not had a chance to sit down for a century. And the tears came into his eyes. Poor devil, I said. I should not have been so harsh with you. And you are an orphan too, no doubt. But sit down on the floor here. Nothing else can stand your weight. And besides, we cannot be sociable with you away up there above me. I want you down where I can perch on this high-counting stool and gossip with you face to face. So he sat down on the floor and lit a pipe which I gave him, threw one of my red blankets over his shoulders, inverted my sitz bath on his head, helmet fashion, and made himself picturesque and comfortable. Then he crossed his ankles while I renewed the fire and exposed the flat, honeycombed bottoms of his prodigious feet to the grateful warmth. What is the matter with the bottom of your feet and the back of your legs, that they are gouged up so? Infernal chilblains, I caught them clear up to the back of my head, roosting out there under Newell's farm. But I love the place. I love it as one loves his old home. There is no peace for me like the peace I feel when I am there. We talked along for half an hour, and then I noticed that he looked tired and spoke of it. Tired? He said. Well, I should think so, and now I will tell you all about it, since you have treated me so well. I am the spirit of the petrified man that lies across the street there in the museum. I am the ghost of the Cardiff giant. I can have no rest, no peace, till they have given that poor body burial again. Now what was the most natural thing for me to do, to make men satisfy this wish? Terrify them into it. Haunted the place where the body lay, and so I haunted the museum night after night. I even got the other spirits to help me, but it did no good, for nobody ever came to the museum at midnight. Then it occurred to me to come over the way and haunt this place a little. I felt that if I ever got a hearing I must succeed, for I had the most efficient company that perdition could furnish. Night after night we have shivered around through these mildewed halls, dragging chains, groaning, whispering, tramping up and down stairs, till, to tell you the truth, I am almost worn out. But when I saw the light in your room tonight, I roused my energies again and went at it with a deal of old freshness. But I am tired out, entirely fagged out. Give me, I beseech you, give me some hope. I let off my perch in a burst of excitement and exclaimed, "This transcends everything, everything that did ever occur. Why, you poor blundering old fossil, you have had all your trouble for nothing. You have been haunting a plaster cast of yourself. The real Cardiff giant is in Albany. Confound it, don't you know your own remains?" I never saw such an eloquent look of shame, of pitiable humiliation, overspread a countenance before. The petrified man rose slowly to his feet and said, "Honestly, is that true?" "As true as I am sitting here." He took the pipe from his mouth and laid it on the mantel, then stood irresolute for a moment, unconsciously, from old habit, thrusting his hands where his pantaloon pockets should have been, and meditatively dropping his chin on his breast, and finally said, "Well, I never felt so absurd before. The petrified man has sold everybody else, and now the mean fraud has ended by selling his own ghost. My son, if there is any charity left in your heart for a poor friendless phantom like me, don't let this get out. Think how you would feel if you had made such ass of yourself." I heard his stately tramp die away, step by step down the stairs and out onto the deserted street, and felt sorry that he was gone, poor fellow, and sorrier still that he had carried off my red blanket and my bathtub. Buckingham is as pleasant a shire as a man shall see on a 7 days' journey. Neither was it any less pleasant in the days of our Lord King Edward, the third of that name, he who fought and put the French to shameful discomfiture at Crecy and Poitiers, and at many another hard-fought field. May God rest his soul, for he now sleeps in the great church at Westminster. Buckinghamshire is full of smooth round hills and woodlands of hawthorn and beech, and it is a famous country for its brooks and shaded waterways running through the low hay meadows. Upon its hills feed 1,000 sheep, scattered like the remnants of spring snow, and it was from these that the merchants made themselves fat purses, sending the wool into Flanders in exchange for silver crowns. There were many strong castles there, too, and rich abbeys, and the king's highway ran through it from north to south, upon which the pilgrims went in crowds to worship at the shrine of the blessed St. Alban. Thereon also rode noble knights and stout men-at-arms, and these you could follow with the eye by their glistening armor, as they wound over hill and dale, mile after mile, with shining spears and shields, and fluttering pennons, and anon a trumpet or two sounding the same keen note as that which rang out dreadfully on those bloody fields of France. The girls used to come to the cottage doors, or run to hide themselves in the wayside woods to see them go trampling by, for Buckinghamshire girls love a soldier above all men, nor, I warrant you, were the jolly friars lacking in the highways and the byways and under the hedges, good men of religion, comfortable of penance and easy of life, who could tip a wink to a housewife and drink and crack a joke with good men, going on their several ways with tight paunches, skins full of ale, and a merry salutation for everyone. A fat pleasant land was this Buckinghamshire, always plenty to eat and drink therein, and pretty girls and lusty fellows, and God knows what more a man can expect in a world where all is vanity, as the preacher truly says. There was a nunnery at Maids Morton, 2 miles out from Buckingham Borough, on the road to Stony Stratford, and the place was called Maids Morton because of the nunnery. Very devout creatures were the nuns, being holy ladies out of families of gentle blood. They punctually fulfilled to the letter all the commands of the pious founder, just as they were blazoned on the great parchment regula, which the Lady Mother kept on her reading desk in her little cell. If ever any of the nuns, by any chance or subtle machination of the evil one, was guilty of the smallest backsliding from the conduct that beseemed them, they made full and devout confession thereof to the Holy Father who visited them for this purpose. This good man loved swan's meat and galingale, and the charitable nuns never failed to provide of their best for him on his visiting days. and whatsoever penance he laid upon them they performed to the utmost and with due contrition of heart. From matins to compline, they regularly and decently carried out the services of the Holy Mother Church. After dinner, one read aloud to them from the rule, and again after supper, there was reading from the life of some noble saint or virgin, that thereby they might find ensample for themselves on their own earthly pilgrimage. For the rest, they tended their herb garden, reared their chickens, which were famous for miles around, and kept strict watch over their haywards and swineherds. If time was when they had nothing more important on hand, they set to and made the prettiest blood bandages imaginable for the bishop, the bishop's chaplain, the archdeacon, the neighboring abbot, and other godly men of religion round about, who were forced often to bleed themselves for their health's sake and their eternal salvation, so that these venerable men in process of time came to have by them great chests full of these useful articles. If little tongues wagged now and then, as the sisters sat at their sewing in the great hall, who shall blame them? Ava Precatrice? Not I. Besides, some of them were something stricken in years, and old women are garrulous and hard to be constrained from chattering and gossiping, but being devout women, they could have spoken no evil. One evening after vespers, all these good nuns sat at supper, the abbess on her high dais, and the nuns ranged up and down the hall at the long trestled tables. The abbess had just said gratias, and the sisters had sung Qui vivit et regnat per omnium secula seculorum. Amen. When in came the manciple mysteriously, and with many deprecating bows and outstretching of hands, sidled himself up on the dais, and, permission having been given to him, spoke to the Lady Mother thus: Madam, there is a certain pilgrim at the gate who asks for refreshment and a night's lodging. It is true he spoke softly, but little pink ears are sharp of hearing, and nuns, from their secluded way of life, love to hear news of the great world. Send him away, said the abbess. It is not fit that a man should lie within this house. Madam, he asks for food and a bed of straw, lest he should starve of hunger and exhaustion on his way to do penance and worship at the holy shrine of the blessed Saint Alban. What kind of pilgrim is he? Madam, to speak truly, I know not, but he appears of a revered and gracious aspect, a young man well spoken and well disposed. Madam knows it waxeth late, and the ways are dark and foul. I would not have a young man who is given to pilgrimages and good works to faint and starve by the wayside. Let him sleep with the Haywards. But, madam, he is a young man of goodly appearance and conversation, saving your reverence. I would not wish to ask him to eat and sleep with the churls. He must sleep without. Let him, however, enter and eat of our poor table. Madam, I will strictly enjoin him what you command. He hath with him, however, an instrument of music, and would fain cheer you with spiritual songs. A little shiver of anticipation ran down the benches of the great hall, and the nuns fell to whispering, Take care, Sir Manciple, that he not be some light juggler, a singer of vain songs, a mocker. I would not have these quiet halls disturbed by wanton music and unholy words. God forbid, and she crossed herself. Madam, I will answer for it. The Manciple bowed himself from the dais, and went down the middle of the hall, his keys rattling at his belt. A little buzz of conversation rose from the sisters, and went up to the oak-roofed trees, like the singing of bees. The abbess told her beads. The hall door opened, and in came the pilgrim. God knows what manner of man he was. I cannot tell you. He certainly was lean and lithe like a cat. His eyes danced in his head like the very devil, but his cheeks and jaws were as bare of flesh as any hermit that lives on roots and ditch water. His yellow-hosed legs went like the tune of a May game, and he screwed and twisted his scarlet-jerkined body in time with them. In his left hand he held a cithern, on which he twanged with his right, making a cunning noise that titillated the backbones of those who heard it, and teased every delicate nerve of the body. Such a tune would have tickled the ribs of Death himself. A queer fellow to go pilgriming, certainly, but why? When they saw him, all the young nuns tittered and the old nuns grinned until they showed their red gums. It is hard to tell. Even the Lady Mother on the dais smiled, though she tried to frown a moment later. The pilgrim stepped lightly up to the dais. the infernal devil in his legs making the nuns think of the games the village folk play all night in the churchyard on St. John's Eve. "Gracious Mother," he cried, bowing deeply in comely wise, "allow a poor pilgrim on his way to confess and do penance at the shrine of St. Alban to take food in your hall, and to rest with the Haywards this night, and let me thereof make some small recompense with a few sacred numbers, such as your pious founder would not have disdained to hear." "Young man," returned the abbess, "right glad am I to hear that God has moved thy heart to godly works, and to go on pilgrimages, and verily I wish that may be to thy soul's health, and to the respite of thy pains hereafter. I am right willing that thou shouldst refresh thyself with meat and rest at this holy place. Madam, I thank thee from my heart, but as some slight token of gratitude for so large a favor, let me, I pray thee, sing one or two of my divine songs, to the uplifting of these holy sisters' hearts." Another burst of chatter, louder than before, from the benches in the hall. One or two of the younger sisters clapped their plump white hands and cried, "Oh!" The lady abbess held up her hand for silence. "Verily, I should be glad to hear some sweet songs of religion, and I think it would be to the uplifting of these sisters' hearts. But, young man, take warning against singing any wanton lines of vain imagination, such as the ribalds used on the highway, and the idlers and the haunters of taverns. I have heard them in my youth, although my ears tingle to think of them now, and I should think it shame that any such light words should echo among these sacred rafters, or disturb the slumber of our pious founder, who now sleeps in Christ. Let me remind you of what saith Saint Jeremy, Onager solitaris, indestiro anime sue attraxit ventum amoris. The wild ass of the wilderness, in the desire of his heart, snuffeth up the wind of love, whereby that holy man signifies that vain earthly love, which is but wind and air, shall avail nothing at all, when this weak, impure flesh is sloughed away. Madam, such songs as I shall sing, I learnt at the mouth of our holy parish priest, Sir Thomas, a man of all good learning and purity of heart." "In that case," said the abbess, "sing in God's name, but stand at the end of the hall, for it suits not the dignity of my office a man should stand so near the dais." Whereon the pilgrim, making obeisance, went to the end of the hall, and the eyes of all the nuns danced after his dancing legs, and their ears hung on the clear, sweet notes he struck out of his cithern as he walked. He took his place with his back against the great hall door, in such attitude as men use when they play the cithern. A little trembling ran through the nuns, and some rose from their seats and knelt on the benches, leaning over the table, the better to see and hear him. Their eyes sparkled like dew on meadow sweet on a fair morning. Certainly his fingers were bewitched, or else the devil was in his cithern, for such sweet sounds had never been heard in the hall since the day when it was built and consecrated to the service of the servants of God. The shrill notes fell like a tinkling rain from the high roof in the mad, fantastic trills and dying falls that brought all one's soul to one's lips to suck them in. What he sang about, God only knows. Not one of the nuns or even the holy abbess herself could have told you, although you had offered her a piece of the true cross or a hair of the Blessed Virgin for a single word. But a divine yearning filled all their hearts. They seemed to hear 10,000 angels singing in choruses. Alleluia, Alleluia, Alleluia. They floated up on the impalpable clouds of azure and silver, up through the blissful paradises of the uppermost heaven. Their nostrils were filled with the odors of exquisite spices and herbs, and smoke of incense. Their eyes dazzled at splendors and lights and glories. Their ears were full of gorgeous harmonies and all created concords of sweet sounds. The very fibers of being were loosened within them, as though their souls would leap forth from their bodies in exquisite dissolution. The eyes of the younger nuns grew round and large and tender, and their breath almost died upon their velvet lips. As for the old nuns, the great salt tears coursed down their withered cheeks and fell like rain on their gnarled hands. The abbess sat on her dais with her lips apart, looking into space, 10,000 miles away. But no one saw her, and she saw no one. Everyone had forgotten everyone else in that delicious intoxication. Then, with a shrill cry, full of human yearnings and desire, the minstrel came to a sudden stop. Western wind, when wilt thou blow? And the small rain will down rain. Christ, if my love were in my arms, and I in my bed again. Silence. Not one of the holy sisters spoke, but some sighed. Some put their hands over their hearts, and one put her hand in her hood. But when she felt her hair shorn close to her scalp, drew it out again sharply, as though she had touched red-hot iron, and cried, "O Jesu!" Sister Peronelle, a toothless old woman, began to speak in a cracked, high voice, quickly and monotonously, as though she spoke in a dream. Her eyes were wet and red. Her thin lips trembled. "God knows," she said. "I loved him. God knows it. But I bid all those who be maids here to be mindful of the woods, for they are green, but they are deep and dark, and it is merry in the springtime, with the thick turf below and the good boughs above, all alone with your heart's darling, all alone in the green wood. But God help me, you would not stay any more than snow at Easter. I thought just now that I was back with him in the woods. God keep all those that be maids from the green woods." The pretty Sister Ursula, who had only just finished her novitiate, was as white as a sheet. Her breath came thickly and quick as though she bore a great burden up the hill. A great sigh made her comely shoulders rise and fall. "Blessed Virgin," she cried, "ah, ye ask too much. I did not know. God help me, I did not know." And her gray eyes filled with sudden tears, and she dropped her head on her arms on the table and sobbed aloud. Then cried out Sister Catherine, who looked as old and dead as a twig dropped from a tree of last autumn, and at whom the younger sisters privily mocked. "It is the wars, the cursed wars. I have held his head in this lap. I tell you, I have kissed his soul into mine, but now he lies dead, and his pretty limbs all dropped away into earth. Holy Mother, have pity on me. I shall never kiss his sweet lips again, or look into his jolly eyes. My heart is broken long since. Holy Mother, Holy Mother!" "He must come oftener," said a plump sister of 30, with a little nose turned up at the end, eyes black as sloes, and lips as round as a plum. "I go to the orchard day after day, and gather my lap full of apples. He is my darling. Why does he not come? I look for him every time that I gather the ripe apples. He used to come, but that was in the spring, and Our Lady knows that is long ago. Will it not be spring again soon? I have gathered many ripe apples." Sister Margarita rocked herself to and fro in her seat and crossed her arms on her breast. She was singing quietly to herself. "Lula, lule, thou tiny little child, lula, lule, lule, suck at my breast that am thereat beguiled, lula, lule, lule," she moaned to herself. "I have seen the village women go to the well, carrying their babies with them, and they laugh as they go by on the way. Their babies hold them tight around the neck, and their mothers comfort them, saying, 'Hey, hey, my little son, hey, hey, my sweetling.' Christ and the blessed saints know that I have never felt a baby's little hand in my bosom, and now I shall die without it, for I am old and past the age of bearing children. Lula, lule, thou little tiny boy, lula, lule, lule, to feel thee suck doth soothe my great annoy, lula, lule, lule." "I have heard them on the May morning, with their pipes and tabors and jolly, jolly music," cried Sister Helen. "I have seen them too, and my heart has gone with them to bring back the white hawthorn from the woods. A man and a maid to a hawthorn bough, as it says in the song. They sing outside my window all St. John's Eve, so that I cannot say my prayers for the wild thoughts they put into my brain as they go dancing up and down in the churchyard. I cannot forget the pretty words they say to each other. 'Sweet love, a kiss. Kiss me, my love, nor let me go.' As I went through the garden gate, a bonny black night, and what will you give me? A kiss, no more than a kiss, under the wild rose tree. O Mary Mother, have pity on a poor girl's heart. I shall die, if no one love me, I shall die." "In faith, I am truly sorry, William," said Sister Agnes, who was gaunt and hollow-eyed with long vigils and over-fasting, for which the good Father had rebuked her time after time, saying that she overtasked the poor weak flesh. I am truly sorry that I could not wait, but the neighbors made such a clamor, and my father and mother buffeted me too sorely. It is under the oak tree, no more than a foot deep, and covered with the red and brown leaves. It was a pretty sight to see the red blood on its neck, as white as whalebone, and it neither cried nor wept, so I put it down among the leaves, the pretty poppet, and it was like thee, William, it was like thee. I am sorry I did not wait, and now I mourn and wan for thy sake, this many a long year, and all in vain, for thou never comest. I am an old woman now, and I shall soon be quiet and not complain any more. Some of the sisters were sobbing as if their hearts would break. Some sat quiet and still, and let the tears fall from their eyes unchecked. Some smiled and cried together. Some sighed a little and trembled like aspen leaves in a southern wind. The great candles in the hall were burning down to their sockets. One by one they spluttered out. A ghostly flickering light fell upon the legend over the broad days. Connubium mundum sed virginitas paradisum complete. Marriage replenisheth the world, but virginity paradise. Dong, dong, dong. Suddenly the great bell of the nunnery began to toll. With a cry, the abbess sprang to her feet. There were tear stains on her white cheeks, and her hand shook as she pointed fiercely to the door. Away, false pilgrim, she cried. Silence, foul blasphemer. Retro me Satanas. She crossed herself again and again, saying Pater Noster. The nuns screamed and trembled with terror. A little cloud of blue smoke arose from where the minstrel had stood. There was a little tongue of flame, and he had disappeared. It was almost dark in the hall. A few sobs broke the silence. The dying light of a single candle fell on the form of the Lady Mother. Tomorrow, she said, we shall fast and sing Placebo and Thurage and the 7 penitential psalms. May the Holy God have mercy upon us for all we have done and said and thought amiss this night. Amen. Not far from Alameda, in the city of Mexico, there is a great old stone building in which once lived a very wealthy and wicked Spanish count. The house has about 4 floors and 90 rooms, more or less. The entire 4th floor is rented and occupied by a big American firm, and their bookkeeper, an American girl, has given us the following true account of the ghosts that for years haunted the building. The 2nd floor is unoccupied, as no one cares to live there for obvious reasons, and the bottom floor is also unoccupied, save for lumber rooms, empty boxes, and crates and barrels. And last of all is the great patio with its tile floor, where secretly in the night a duel was fought to the death by the wicked count and a famous Austrian prince who was once Maximilian's men. The count was killed. No one knows why the duel was fought. Some say it was because of a beautiful Spanish woman. Some say that it was because of treasure that the two jointly conveyed, and which the count refused to divide with his princely socio. And more people, Mexicans, shrug their shoulders if you ask about it, and say, "Quien sabe?" "I saw a ghost here last night, Miss James," announces our cashier, with much eclat and evident pride. So great is the shock that I gasp, and my pen drops, spattering red ink on my nice fresh cuffs, and on the ledger page that I had just totted up. It is ruined, and I will have to erase it, or something. Wretched man. "I wish to goodness it had taken you off," I cry wrathfully, as I look at the bespattered work. "Now will you just look here and see what you have done? I wish you and your ghosts were in Gehenna," he inquires sweetly. "I'll fix that, but it won't take half a minute. And don't look so stern, else I won't tell you about the Espanto, and you will be sorry if you don't hear about it. It would make such a good story. Then go ahead with it. Well, last night I was waiting for West. He was to meet me here, after which it was our intention to hit the... That is, I mean we were going out together. And it seems that while I was patiently waiting here, in my usual sweet-tempered way, the blank idiot had his supper and then lay down to rest himself for a while. You know how delicate he is. Unfortunately, he forgot the engagement and slept on. He says he never awoke until 3 o'clock and so didn't come, thinking I wouldn't be there. Meantime, I also went to sleep, I might have snoozed on until 3, likewise, but for the fact that the ghost woke me. Well, do go on, I urge. The ghost woke me, as I said, proceeds the simpleton, slowly. It was passing its cold fingers over my face and groaning. Really, it was most extraordinary. At first I didn't know what it was. Then, as I felt the icy fingers stroking my face and heard blood-curdling groans issuing from the darkness, I knew what it was. And I remembered the story of the prince and his little duel down in the patio, and I knew it was the ghost of the prince's victim. By the way, you don't know what a funny sensation it is to have a ghost pat your face, Miss James. Pat nothing, I retort indignantly. I wonder you are not ashamed to tell me such fibs, such a taradiddle. And as for the man that the prince killed downstairs, you know as well as I do that he was taken home to Spain and buried there. Why then should he come back here, into our offices, and pat your face? Ah, that I can't say, with a supercilious drawl. I can only account for it by thinking that the ghost has good taste, better than that of some people I know. But honestly, I swear that I am telling you the truth. Cross my heart and hope to die if I am not. And you don't know how brave I was. I never screamed. In fact, I never made a sound. Oh, I was brave. Then what did you do? I ran. Por Dios, how I ran. You remember with what alacrity we got downstairs during the November earthquake. Well, last night's run wasn't a run in comparison. It was a disappearance, a flight, a sprint. I went down the 4 flights of stairs like a streak of blue lightning, and the ghost flew with me. I heard the pattering of its steps and its groans clean down to the patio door, and I assure you I quite thought I had made such an impression that it was actually going on home with me, and the thought made me feel so weak that I felt perforce obligated to take that is, strengthen myself with a cocktail. After which I felt stronger and went home quite peacefully. But it was an uncanny experience, wasn't it? Was it before or after taking that cocktail? I asked incredulously. And did you take only 1 or 11? I am hard on the man, but he really deserves it. Ghost. Spirits perhaps, but not ghosts. Whereat his feelings are quite hurted, so much that he vows he will never tell me anything again. I had better read about Doubting Thomas. He had never seen such an unbelieving woman in all his life, and if I were only a man, he would be tempted to pray that I might see the ghost. It would serve me right. Then, wrathfully departs, to notice me no more that day. Not believing the least bit in ghosts, I gave the matter no more thought. In fact, when you fall heir to a set of books that haven't been posted for 19 days, and you have to do it all, and get up your trial balance too, or else give up your Christmas holidays, you haven't much time to think about ghosts, or anything else, except entries. And though I had been working 14 hours per day, the 24th of December, noon hour, found me with a difference of $13.89, which I, of course, must locate and straighten out before departing next morning on my week's holiday. Por supuesto, it meant night work. Nothing else would do, and besides, our plan had all been to leave on the 8 o'clock train the next morning. So I would just sit up all night, if need be, and find the wretched balance and be done with it. Behold me settled for work that night at 7 o'clock in my own office, with 3 lamps burning to keep it from looking dismal and lonely, and books and ledgers and journals piled up 2 feet high around me. If hard work would locate that nasty, hateful $13.89, it would surely be found. I had told the portero downstairs on the ground floor to try and keep awake for a time, but if I didn't soon finish the work, I would come down and call him when I was ready to go home. He lived in a little room, all shut off from the rest of the building, so that it was rather difficult to get at him. Besides, he was the very laziest and sleepiest peon possible, and though he was supposed to take care of the big building at night, patrolling it so as to keep off ladrones, he in reality slept so soundly that the last trumpet, much less Mexican robbers, would not have roused him. And for this very reason, before settling to my work, I was careful to go round and look to locks and bolts myself. Everything was secure, and the doors safely fastened, so that if ladrones did break through, they would have to be in shape to pass through keyholes or possess false keys. With never a thought of spirits or porteros or anything else beyond the $13.89, I worked and added and re-added and footed up, and at 11 o'clock, gracias a Dios, I had the $13 all safe and would have whooped for joy had I time. However, I wasn't out of the woods yet, the sum of $89 being often more easy to locate than 89 cents. The latter must be found also before I could have the pleasure of shouting in celebration thereof. At it I went again. After brain cudgeling and more adding and prayerful thought, I at last had under my thumb that abominable 80 cents. Eureka! Only 9 cents out. I could get it all straight and have some sleep after all. Inspired by which thought, I smothered my yawns and again began to add. I looked at my watch. 10 minutes to 12. Perhaps I could get it fixed before 1. I suppose I had worked at the 9 cents for about 20 minutes. One of the cash entries looked to me to be in error. I compared it with the voucher. Yes, that's just where the trouble lay. 11 cents. 10. 9. St. Out went the lights in the twinkling of an eye, as I sat, gaping in my astonishment. From out of the pitchy darkness of the room came the most dreary, horrible, blood-curdling groan imaginable. As I sat paralyzed, not daring to breathe, doubting my senses for a moment, and then thinking indignantly that it was some trick of that wretched cashier, I felt long, thin, icy fingers passing gently over my face. Malgame Dios, what a sensation! At first I was afraid to move. Then I nervously tried to brush the icy, bony things away. As fast as I brushed, with my heart beating like a steam hammer, and gasping with deadly fear, the fingers would come back again, a cold wind blowing over me. Again came that dreadful groan, and too frightened to move or scream, I stumbled in a heap on the floor, among the books and ledgers. Then I suppose I fainted. When I regained my senses, I was still in a heap with the ledgers. Still, it was dark, and still, I felt the cold fingers caressing my face, at which I became thoroughly desperate. No ghost should own me. I had laughed at the poor cashier, and hinted darkly at cocktails. Pray, what better was I? I scrambled to my feet, the fingers still stroking my face. I must address them. What language? Did they understand English or Spanish, I wondered? Spanish would doubtless be more suitable, if indeed it was the ghost of the murdered count. Will you do me the favor, Senor Ghost? I started out bravely, in my best Spanish, but with a very trembling voice, to inform me what it is that you desire. Is there anything I can do for you? Because if not, I would like very much to be allowed to finish my work, which I cannot do if I am not alone. Perhaps the ghost did not understand my Spanish. At any rate, there was no articulate reply. There was another groan. Again the fingers touched me. And then there was such a mournful sigh that I felt sorry for the poor thing. What could be the matter with it? With my pity, all fear was lost for a moment, and I said to the darkness all about me, "What is it that you wish, pobre señor? Can I not aid you? I am not afraid. Let me help you." The fingers moved uncertainly for a moment, then the ledgers all fell down, with a loud bang. A cold hand caught mine, very gently. I tried not to feel frightened, but it was difficult, and I was led off blindly through the offices. I could not see a thing. Not a glimmer of light showed. Not a sound was heard except my own footsteps, and the faint sound of the invisible something that was leading me along. There were no more groans, thank goodness, else I should have shrieked and fainted, without a doubt. Only the pattering footsteps and the cold hand that led me on and on. We, the fingers and I, were somehow in the great hall, then on the second floor, and at last on the stairs, going on down, flight after flight. Then I knew that I was being led about by the fingers on the tiled floor of the patio, and close to the portero's lodge. Simpleton that he was, sleeping like a log no doubt, while I was being led about in the darkness by an invisible hand and no one to save me. I would have yelled, of course, but for one fact, I found it utterly impossible to speak or move my tongue, being a rare and uncomfortable sensation. But where were we going? Back into the unused lumber rooms, joining onto the patio? Nothing there except barrels and slabs and empty boxes. What could the ghost mean? He must be utterly demented, surely. In the middle of the first room, we paused. I had an idea of rushing out and screaming for the portero, but abandoned it when I found that my feet wouldn't go. I heard steps passing to and fro about the floor and waited, cold and trembling. They approached me. Again, my hand was taken, and I was led over near the corner of the room. Obedient to the unseen will, I bent down and groped about the floor, guided by the cold fingers holding mine, until I felt something like a tiny ring set firmly on the floor. I pulled at it faintly, but it did not move, at which the ghost gave a faint sigh. For a second, the cold fingers pressed mine, quite affectionately, then released me, and I heard steps passing slowly onto the patio, then dying away. Where was it going? What on earth did it all mean? But I was so tired and wrought up I tried to find the door, but couldn't, and at last, too fatigued and sleepy to stand, I dropped down on the cold floor and went to sleep. I must have slept for some hours, for when I awoke the light of dawn was coming in at the window, and I sat up and wondered if I had taken leave of my senses during the night. What on earth could I be doing here in the lumber room? Then, like a flash, I remembered, and, half unconsciously, crept about on the floor seeking the small ring. There it was. I caught it and jerked at it hard. Hey, presto, change! For it seemed to me that the entire floor was giving way. There was a sliding, crashing sound, and I found myself hanging on for dear life to a barrel that, fortunately, retained its equilibrium, and with my feet dangling into space. Down below me was a small, stone-floored room, with big boxes and small ones ranged about the walls. Treasure! Like a flash the thought struck me, and with one leap I was down in the secret room gazing about the boxes. But alas, upon investigation, the biggest chest proved empty. The bad, wicked Count, no wonder he couldn't rest in his Spanish grave, but must come back to the scene of his wickedness and deceit to make reparation. But the smaller chests were literally crammed with all sorts of things. Big heavy Spanish coins and gold and silver dinner services with the crest of the unfortunate emperor, magnificent pieces of jeweled armor and weapons, beautiful jewelry and loose precious stones. I deliberately selected handfuls of the latter, giving my preference to the diamonds and pearls. I had always had a taste for them, which I had never before been able to gratify, and packed them into a wooden box that I found in the lumber room. The gold and dinner services and armor, etc., I left as they were, being rather cumbersome, and carried off, rejoicing, my big box of diamonds and pearls and other jewelry. Needless to say, we didn't go away for the holidays on the 8 o'clock train, but I did come down to the office and proceeded to locate my missing 9 cents, after which I unfolded the tale of the ghost and the treasure, only keeping quiet the matter of my private loot, of which I was heartily glad afterwards, for when the government learned of the find, what do you suppose they offered me for going about with the ghost and discovering the secret room and treasure? $10,000, when I refused, stating that I would take merely as my reward one of the gold dinner services. The greedy things objected at first, but I finally had my way, and to this very day they have no idea that I, even I, have all the beautiful jewels. Wouldn't they be furious if they knew it? But they aren't apt to, unless they learn English and read this story, which isn't likely. Dear readers, do you agree with Hamlet? Do you believe that there is more between heaven and earth than we dream of in our philosophy? Does it seem possible to you that Alpheus Levi conjured up the shade of Apollonius of Tyana, the prophet of the Magi, in a London hotel, and that the great sage William Crookes drank his tea at breakfast several days a week, for months in succession, in the society of the materialized spirit of a young lady, attired in white linen, with a feather turban on her head? Do not laugh. Panic would seize you in the presence of even a turbaned spirit, and the grotesque spectacle would but intensify your terror. As for me, I did not laugh last night on reading an account in the New York newspaper of a criminal trial that would probably terminate in the death penalty of the accused. It is a sad case. I shudder as I transcribe the records of the trial from the testimony of the hotel waiter who heard the conversation of the two Confederates through a keyhole, and of 40 thoroughly credible witnesses who testified to the same facts. What would be my feelings if I had seen the beautiful victim with the gaping wound in her breast, into which she had dipped her fingers to mark the brow of her murderer? About 3 o'clock on the afternoon of February 3rd, Professor Davenport and Miss Ida Chauceau, a very pale and delicate young girl who had submitted to the tests of Professor Davenport for a number of years, were finishing their dinner in their room in the second story of a New York hotel. Professor Benjamin Davenport was a celebrity, but it was said that he owed his fame to somewhat questionable means. The leading spiritualists did not repose the confidence in him that manifestly marked their regard for William Crookes or Daniel Douglas Home. Greedy and unscrupulous mediums, the author of spiritualism in America thinks, are to blame for the most bitter attacks to which our cause has been exposed. When the materializations do not take place as quickly as circumstances require, they resort to trickery and fraud to extricate themselves from a dilemma. Professor Benjamin Davenport belonged to these versatile mediums. Aside from this, queer stories were afloat about him. He was secretly accused of highway robbery in South America, cheating at cards in the gambling houses of San Francisco, and the over-hasty use of firearms towards persons who had never even offended him. It was said almost openly that the professor's wife had died from abuse and grief at his infidelity. But in spite of these annoying rumors, Mr. Davenport, by virtue of his skill as a fraud and faker, continued to exercise a great deal of influence upon the plain and simple-minded folk, whom it was impossible to convince that they had not touched the materialized spirit of their brothers, mothers, or sisters through the agency of his wonderful power. His professional success received material accession from his swarthy, Mephisto-like countenance, his deep, fiery eyes, his large curved nose, the cynical expression of his mouth, and the lofty, almost prophetic tone of his words. When the waiter had made his last visit, he did not go far. The following conversation took place in the room. "There is to be a séance this evening at the residence of Miss Harding," began the medium. "Quite a number of influential people will be there, and 2 or 3 millionaires. Conceal under your skirt the blonde woman's wig and the white material in which the spirits usually make their appearance." "Very well," replied Ida Chauceau in a resigned tone. The waiter heard her pace the room. After a pause, she asked, "Whose spirit are you going to control this evening, Benjamin?" The waiter heard a loud, brutal laugh and the chair groaning beneath the weight of the demonstrative professor. "Guess." "How should I know?" she asked. "I am going to conjure up the spirit of my dead wife." Another burst of laughter issued from the room, full of sinister levity. A cry of terror burst from Ida's lips. A muffled sound indicated to the eavesdropper at the door that she was dragging herself to the feet of the professor. "Benjamin, Benjamin, don't do it," she sobbed. "Why not? They say I broke Mrs. Davenport's heart. The story is damaging to my reputation, but it will be forgotten if her spirit should address me in terms of endearment from the other shore, in the presence of numerous witnesses. For you will speak to me tenderly, will you not, Ida?" "No, no, you shall not do it. You shall not think of it. Listen to me, for God's sake. During the 4 years that I have been with you, I have obeyed you faithfully and suffered patiently. I have lied and deceived, like you. I learned to imitate the sleep and symptoms of clairvoyance. Tell me, did I ever refuse to serve you, or utter a word of complaint, even when my shoulders bent with the weight of my burden, when you pierced the flesh of my arms with knitting needles? Worse than all this, I imitated distant voices behind curtains, and made mothers and wives believe that their sons and husbands had come from a better world to communicate with them. How often have I performed the most dangerous feats in parlors with the lamps turned low, clothed in a shroud or white muslin, I essayed to represent the supernatural forms, whom tear-dimmed eyes recognized as those of departed dear ones. You do not know what I suffered at this unhallowed work. You scoff at the mysteries of eternity. I suffer the torments of an impending retribution. My God, if sometime the dead whom I counterfeit should rise up before me with uplifted arms and dreadful imprecations, this constant terror has injured my heart. It will kill me. I am consumed by fever. Look how emaciated, how worn out and downcast I am. But I am under your control. Do as you like with me. I am in your power, and I want it to be so. Have I ever complained? But do not force me to do this thing, Benjamin. Have pity on me for what I have done for you in the past, for what I am suffering. Do not attempt this mummery. Do not compel me to play the role of your dead wife, who was so tender and beautiful. Oh, what put that thought into your mind? Spare me, Benjamin, I implore you. The professor did not laugh again. Amid the confusion of upturned articles of furniture, the eavesdropper distinguished the sound of a skull striking the floor. He concluded that Professor Davenport had knocked Miss Ida down with a blow of his fist, or had kicked her as she approached him. But the waiter did not enter the room, as no one rang for him. 40 persons were assembled in Mrs. Joanne Harding's parlor, staring at the curtain where a spirit form was in process of materializing. One dark lantern in a corner of the room contributed the light that emphasized the darkness rather than relieved it. The room was pervaded by profound silence, save the quickened, suppressed breathing of the spectators. The fire in the grate cast mysterious rays of light, resembling fugitive spirits, upon the objects around, almost indistinguishable in the semi-gloom. Professor Davenport was at his best this evening. The spirit world obeyed him without hesitation, like their lawful master. He was the mighty Prince of Souls. Hands that had no arms were seen picking flowers from the vases. The touch of an invisible spirit conjured sweet melodies from the keys of the piano. The furniture responded by intelligent rappings to the most unanticipated questions. The professor himself elevated his form in symbolic distortions from the floor to an altitude of 3 feet, indicated by Mrs. Harding, and remained suspended in the air for a quarter of an hour, holding live coals in his hands. But the most interesting, as well as the most conclusive, test was to be the materialization of the spirit of Mrs. Arabella Davenport, which the professor had promised at the beginning of the séance. "The hour has come," exclaimed the medium, and while all the hearts throbbed with anxious suspense, and their eyes distended with painful expectancy of the promised materialization, Benjamin Davenport stood before the curtain. In the twilight, the tall man with the disheveled hair and demon look was really terrible and handsome. "Appear, Arabella," he exclaimed in a commanding voice, with gestures of the Nazarene at the sepulchre of Lazarus. All are waiting. Suddenly, a cry burst from behind the curtain. A piercing, shuddering, horrible shriek, the shriek of an expiring soul. The spectators trembled. Mrs. Harding almost fainted. The medium himself appeared surprised, but Benjamin recovered his composure on seeing the curtain move and admit the spirit. The apparition was that of a young woman with long blonde tresses. She was beautiful and pale, clad in some light whitish material. Her breast was bare, and on the left side appeared a bleeding wound, in which trembled a knife. The spectators arose and retreated, pushing their chairs to the wall. Those who chanced to look at the medium noticed that a deathly pallor had overspread his face, and that he was cowering and trembling. But the young woman, Mrs. Arabella, the real one, whom he so well remembered, she had come in response to his summons, and advanced in a direct line toward Benjamin, who in terror covered his eyes to shut out the ghastly sight, and with a cry fled behind the furniture. But she dipped the finger of her thin hand into the blood from her wound, and traced it across the brow of the unconscious medium, while repeating in a slow, monotonous tone that sounded like the echo of a wail, again and again, "You are my murderer! You are my murderer!" And while he was rolling and tossing in deadly terror on the floor, they turned up the lights. The spirit had vanished, but in the communicating room, behind the curtain, They found the body of poor Miss Ida with horribly distorted features. A physician who was present pronounced it heart stroke, and that is the reason that Professor Benjamin Davenport appeared alone in a New York courtroom to answer to the charge of having murdered his wife 4 years ago in San Francisco.